January 30, 2018 meeting of the Medfield Board of Selectmen, the alternative to the State of the Union. Thank you for all coming. We always start with reminding everybody that we're being recorded, and secondly, we take a moment to appreciate our troops that are serving around the world. Thank you. So tonight is the time to hear from the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee. Welcome.
I guess I'll introduce myself. Steve Nolan, I'm chair of the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee, and a few members of the committee are here with me. Brandy Morris, Gil Rogers, Randy Carr, Lucille, who is one of our resource members. Bill is also a resource member, and John Harney also a resource member. So, and Jean Minion, sorry. Jean's also a resource member. I think I got everybody, at least everybody's official. And we have a number of other people here who've come to a lot of our meetings and contributed. So tonight, the purpose of tonight is sort of to bring you a little bit up to speed. Some of you have been at some of our meetings, and this may be a bit of a repeat for you, but we have put together a tentative, I guess we call it a preferred scenario, and I think hopefully you all got a copy of it. I think we sent it in, and hopefully it was distributed to you. So it kind of lays out the where we currently stand, excuse me, on the redevelopment of the core campus, as well as Lot 3 and the Hinckley property. So I thought, as a starting point, I'd just kind of give you a broad brush overview of it. The principal focus of the reuses is residential, and in particular, we've strived to reuse the existing buildings up on the site to preserve the historic buildings to the extent possible. So if you look at the map of the draft preferred scenario, you'll see that on the right-hand side, we've scheduled that for an assisted living, continuing care, retirement community, or independent living. It's not entirely locked down, because that may evolve as the plan is implemented. That side in particular seemed appropriate for that, because as it backs up on the water tower parcel, we thought it wouldn't be a great sacrifice to views or anything else to have connectors between the buildings. And that type of a senior use is likely to desire to have the buildings connected rather than a bunch of independent separate buildings. We also, if you look at, there's a building called 28N, which is intended to be new construction. The buildings aren't necessarily all laid out for a use such as something more intensive on healthcare or dining halls or things like that. So the idea is to include at least one fairly significant new building that could be constructed as part of that. Then around the rest of the quad is mostly residential of different types. Some affordable with the aim to try to close the gap and potentially get to the 10% under 40B, especially with all the other efforts that have been ongoing in town to get us closer to the 10% mark. In the core of the quad, we have the Lee Chapel and the infirmary, which we have called out as a cultural hub. And Jean has been pretty active in trying to push that along outside the committee efforts, but the use that we have on our plan is to include that as a cultural space. And then two buildings at the front, 22 and 23, would also be affiliated with that potentially as artist live workspace. When you look down more towards to the west, towards the river, you'll see the big former State Police Training Academy building numbered on the plan as 7, which we have as a commercial potential office. Distillery is another idea, but it's commercial use of some type, not specifically limited. And then building 2 on that side, we have slated for an inn, restaurant, wellness facility. Along those lines, although that would be presumably a later phase development, because it'll take a certain amount of activation on the site in order to get enough interest for that.
Can I interrupt you for
Sure.
just a second? Sam, is that a plan of the proposed site?
Yes.
Is that something you can show the people at home?
Yeah, I'm trying to just.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that you were able to show it to people at home. Thank
Okay.
you.
No problem. Up towards I'd say the northwest, on the one parcel that's not yet owned by the town, but is intended to be owned by the town once the cleanup is completed, we slated a new building called 10B, which is possibly a residential new condominium building, as is 10A, which is on the site, which is now that low-slung cinder block building. Bill, what's that one called? Is that the machine shop or something? I don't know.
Yeah, it's the engineering building.
Engineering building. So that would be demolished and a new building constructed there. So there's a little bit of new construction on the site, but by and large, we're showing reuse of existing buildings. If reuse wasn't possible, it would be possible for the buildings to be torn down, but new construction would have to be built roughly within the same footprints as the existing buildings. So that's the gist of the core campus. On Hinckley, I think, as you know, we have assumed some home ownership there. Oh, I did forget, sorry, what we call the Arboretum or the Southeast Quadrant, which we're showing on the core campus plan as being home ownership also. A mix of duplexes and, potentially triplex, potentially single family, but that would be a home ownership neighborhood, if you will, down towards the front of the campus. So on Hinckley, it would also be that kind of home ownership, senior housing, and then Lot 3. I don't think I probably need to say very much about that, other than it's potentially residential, 42 units of residential, or some commercial facility, particularly a potential sports complex. So that's the general overview of the plan. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of phasing, which we haven't really come to grapple with fully yet. But one thing that we're going to include in the master plan is some ideas about how the potential redevelopment would be phased, since it's a lot for the town to absorb all at once. So we would expect to have an idea of phasing, and the idea of the cultural facility as a real draw, as kind of a showpiece for the overall development that would give it a sort of unique character, and also provide a feeling of public ownership, if you will, of the property and public engagement, so that it doesn't become an exclusive community limited to people who actually live there. That would be a great property to redevelop first, or a great building to redevelop first. It does, though, pose some challenges. Number one being there's a lot of fundraising that we have not included that as a town expenditure, so there's a lot of private fundraising that would have to go into that, number one. And number two, there's also infrastructure to get to that building. It's within the core campus, so the infrastructure would have to be brought to the building. So that would be a huge expenditure for that project to bear. So trying to work out phasing that would allow the infrastructure to be brought in conjunction with some private development, but also to benefit the potential arts facility is one of the things we're grappling with, and then how the rest of it would unfold. As I mentioned, some of the commercial uses we feel may have to come a little bit further down the road, because it's going to take a certain level of redevelopment of the rest of the site in order to make it attractive for commercial users. The financials are a big subject. We have a working group. We're working closely with the warrant committee representatives to try and kick the tires on the financials and do a lot of sensitivity testing to really see that, number one, that the plan is workable under our assumptions, but also to look at some of the stresses that could occur and see whether it remains viable from the standpoint of the town. One of the big challenges here is infrastructure. We're looking at an infrastructure cost between Ice House Road and the core campus of something like $25 million. So it's a pretty big number, which ended up, I think, resulting in some of our initial plans way back over a year ago, where the consultant came in with plans showing 600 to 800 units in order to help defray that cost by the private developers. There was some serious pushback against that idea, But the end result of that is by reducing the number of units quite a bit, it ends up putting a lot of stress on the financials and making that number unaffordable, in our opinion, for the private developer. So we engaged with the warrant committee on that subject and stepped back. And the project shows a pretty huge positive cash flow on the town, because a lot of the housing up here is designated as senior housing, particularly the CCRC, but also a certain amount of the other new housing there. So the number of school children isn't that high in our projections, and therefore there's actually a pretty positive tax flow from it. So our consultant had raised the idea of a district improvement financing, which is a bond basically issued by the town against future tax receipts from the redevelopment. So that's an idea that we're exploring that would allow the town to basically borrow against the future revenue stream from the development in order to assist in the payment of the infrastructure. I think what we're leaning towards, though, is that we would make available to a private developer infrastructure funds in order to allow them to install the infrastructure, rather than making the infrastructure project be a project undertaken by the town and subject to public bidding, et cetera. So, in fact, we would expect that we might actually put out an RFP that would offer up to some dollar amount of public assistance for the infrastructure, and the bidding for the property, if you will, would be how much of the public money the developer needed to close its gap and make the project feasible. So, in other words, if we said we'd put up to $20 million out, and a developer came in and said, well, I can do the whole thing and only to use $15 million, and another developer came in and said, well, I'll only use $10 million, that would be basically the way we would measure its positive economic effect, would be the least impact on the town's finances. So it's a kind of upside down model, if you will. You're used to thinking of selling a piece of property and getting a lot of money for it, but because of the burdens of the infrastructure on this, it's actually likely to be the other way around in this case. So that's a pretty important element. The good thing about the DIF financing is that it doesn't go against the town's borrowing limit. So it's, from that perspective, it's beneficial, but it does commit the tax revenues from a redevelopment to service that bond. I guess I don't want to keep on going forever. If you have questions on things I've said, if you want to interrupt me and ask questions, feel free, because I don't want to wait till the very end, at which point.
Questions at this point?
If this isn't the right time to answer this, Steve, I want to go a lot higher. If you looked at the current plan, where do you see the contributions to achieving town goals?
So there's a couple things in that vein. One is well, I'll mention the obvious one, which is affordable housing. By pursuing the redevelopment, we think that we can, hopefully put the finishing touches on reaching our 10% affordable housing stock. The affordable housing is actually helpful here. We projected the potential use of low-income housing tax credit, which was the same financing source that was used in developing the park, which helps bring in resources to close the gap. Some of these are difficult to redevelop because they're historic, so you can qualify for the historic tax credit, but the low-income housing tax credit can be an additional resource to bring to the table as well. So it's our hope, and of course it's a moving target because of all the other things that you're aware of that the town is doing, but given that the bogey has been reduced by some of these other things, we think it's doable that we would reach the 10% when this project was fully implemented. Secondly, there's been a lot of concern about not bringing in too many school-aged children, especially not to the point where we'd actually have to engage in new school construction. So that's one of the reasons why we've as well as the intersection of a lot of interest among seniors for senior housing opportunities. So by designating a fair amount of this housing as senior housing, that helps to reduce the influx of new school children, so that it doesn't put too much strain on the school budget, while at the same time allowing us to address some of the senior housing needs in town. Another thing that we've heard from a lot of townspeople is a desire to keep a lot of this open and not not develop the entire site. So by focusing on the core campus, which has already been developed in the past, and redeveloping it, we would keep large sections, the great lawn at the front and the field at the north, which abuts Dover, as open space for not putting a restriction on it necessarily, but preserving it for the future. If the town ever needed to do something there, they could, but at least for the foreseeable future, that would remain as open space, and allow for a connection from the town into some of the natural areas like the canoe launch and the Charles River Link Trail. So we've also focused on that to keep the site as open as possible and accessible to townspeople. We got a lot of negative feedback about the idea of having a gated community up there. So by having certain commercial uses and the arts facility and a network of trails up there, we would hope to keep the space having a certain public feel to it, so that the taxpayers would feel comfortable going up there and not feel like they were walking into somebody's backyard. The expansion of the commercial tax base is another thing we've heard is a goal of the town, and that's why we've tried to include a reasonable amount of commercial space up there. Our consultant has warned us that we're probably a bit heavy on the commercial space as far as what our market analyses have showed the town can absorb, but by the same token, with a phased approach, some of these buildings may be left undeveloped or unrehabbed for some period of time to allow that commercial use to mature over time. It's a bit of an unknown. So one thing we're conscious of is to build in potential safety valves so that there are multiple uses, so that if a particular use, for instance, the inn up there, doesn't materialize, because that's a real challenging financial proposition, that somewhere down the line that could be used for something different without having to sit vacant for indefinite amounts of time. So we think it would be important as part of the implementation strategy to set some kind of time horizons for how long we would wait to see if those uses would develop before we then decided to relook at that and potentially program it for something different. So those are some of the goals that we focus on. There may be others, but that's at least the ones that come immediately to mind.
And I have one more question. This will be a bit of a curveball. Before the town bought the property, when I was on the shack with you, when we first presented the idea of buying the property in a very oversimplified way at the point of our maximum ignorance, I won't hold you to the numbers, but we were buying the property for $3.1 million. At the time, the best guess for the overall remediation / demolition of the buildings, because we didn't know what would be, we estimated it to be 12 to 15 million is what we told the town.
Right.
And I think in very, again, gross terms, we said, and we're hoping that the property's worth $20 million and that perhaps a developer could actually do the 12 to $15 million remediation and demolition cheaper than that. So there's an arbitrage opportunity there on the labor market. $20 million piece of property, $12 to $15 million in remediation and demolition, $3 million to buy it. When we start talking about the town, whether it's through DIF financing or through something else, needing to put $25 million into the property to build the infrastructure to support the development, what's wrong with the thinking that says, well, the worst that was going to happen, we were into it for another 12 to 15 million, and now 5 years later, make that 20 million. Why not sit there and demolish everything, because we can't find an economically attractive approach to doing what we want to do? I understand this may be sacrilege to some people. I'm asking a hypothetical here, but why don't we just take it all down, make it a green piece of property? We can sell that property, pristine property, be developed. And if it costs us 20 million to demolish everything, that's at least costing the town a lot less than the 25 million that you just threw out. What's wrong with that thinking?
I mean, there's really nothing wrong with that thinking. I mean, that is the baseline proposition that we need to test this against. Is does the town just want to clear the site? We do have constraints because we signed a memorandum of understanding with Mass Historic about potentially allowing reuse of the buildings, and so there's a whole process there. But the interesting thing is it doesn't really mandate that we redevelop anything. So, but the question will be whether we could navigate those shoals and actually get to the point of, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about what the different no-build scenarios are. One is what people call demolition by neglect, is just leaving the buildings up there. If they at some point become unsafe and are about to collapse, we might have to take one down, but until that time, keep them boarded up like they are and try to keep out urban pioneers or whatever you call them, urban explorers who want to get into them, and let them sit there. And so that's a scenario. Another would be to attempt to get approval to demo all of them and say, we're just going to turn it into a big grassy field, or maybe not even a field, let it go back to forest. I mean, it's up to the town, I guess, to decide how open they want to keep the space. But from our perspective, there was a certain desire to come back with some kind of economic development possibility here, which we still favor, but we do think it's fair to examine it against the test case. If people say, oh my God, I just can't even fathom that we would allow that much development, that there is an alternative, and I guess that's the case which we have to make, I guess, in order to get people to vote for the plan.
Just so Gene knows, I wasn't including the Lee Chapel in that massive destruction. So.
Well, the Lee Chapel might become a lonely place and everything else has been torn down.
It turns
Like
more
Little
into
House
a
on the Prairie.
meditation center. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but
Those are
I mean, I appreciate the question, because we have ourselves been discussing that as we build up to, kind of formulate a presentation to the town as to how we present that alternative. Of people say, well, this has gotten too complicated, too expensive, why don't we do nothing? So.
Yeah, I was being more active than doing nothing.
Right.
It was more like, no, why don't we deliberately demolish? I'm not advocating this. It's a benchmark for me. But it was actively, no, we're not doing nothing with the property. We are doing something with the property. We're basically clearing it, and we're selling it as prime real estate for whatever, to sell for top dollar.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the real difficulty that we've found ourselves in is the desire not to overdevelop, and as I mentioned, some of the earlier plans had a pretty intensive development of everything up there and a lot of units, but they did pay for everything, so the town would walk away, maybe with some money in its pocket, or maybe at least, without having to put any money into infrastructure. So that tension, is a difficult one to reconcile, and we've struggled a lot with it. So, I mean, some people feel like what we've proposed is still too dense and still has too many units, but the reality is, if you push it down any further, it really becomes uneconomic.
What was the total unit? What's
I think, there's some squishy room, but I think 294 at the core campus is what we're talking about now. And I think when we presented at town meeting, and you may remember better than I, it was somewhere around 240 or something like that was what we thought at the time was a reasonable plan. But I think at the time we didn't include such a big number for infrastructure in our analysis, which I think is really the difficult thing to.
38 alternates to escape.
Yeah, so we have some alternates built in. And so part of the question becomes, whether we go for that little extra density to allow a little extra profit by a developer, which would help to defray some of the infrastructure costs. So that's a bit of the tension in the plan. So
That's my questions.
Mike?
Could you just describe a little bit what the committee sees as, assuming that this is true, and if it's not true, you can correct me, that what the benefit is of doing a master planning approach to a redevelopment of the property as opposed to something else?
Well, I think the biggest benefit is there's a certain level of predictability about what's going to happen up there, which makes, if you assume that we're just going to take a building and just do something with it and then decide later we're going to do something else with it, with a different building, I think that makes it difficult for anybody any developer certainly coming into this to bid on it, not knowing what else is going to happen, if anything, on the rest of the site. So having a vision for what will happen to the whole site, to me, is important, because it not only sends a signal about what the town's intentions are for the whole campus, but also lends a certain level of predictability to the development process up there. So, I mean, a lot of people at the beginning said, well, nobody will take any of this on a phased approach until you have to do everything all at once. I think that's not quite true, that I think there'll be a certain level of tolerance for some of the buildings remaining undeveloped for some period of time, but I don't think it would be indefinite, that people would not want to at least know that the town had some kind of vision for the overall site in order to embark on the first phase of this, because this is a pretty big development for the town to absorb.
So in light of that, I mean, what are the safeguards or kind of legal restrictions the committee proposes to put on the site to ensure that this is roughly what it ends up looking like at the end of the day, however long it takes, 5 or 10 or 20 years?
Well, two things I'd say to that. First is the way we're designing our overlay zoning. We're intentionally trying to be very careful about having the zoning actually fit what we intend to be up there. It's hard to be too exact about that, but we'd expect it to be a pretty tight range, so that if you built out the maximum level of density permitted by the overlay district, you would actually end up with the number of units that we're projecting within a fairly small band. But the second thing is the manner of disposition. So we've talked a lot about potentially using a ground lease approach for disposition of the property, so that the town retains fee simple ownership and sells, for instance, a 99-year ground lease, which I think works pretty well on rental properties, works less well on home ownership properties. So our thought is that it's likely that down by the southeast quadrant there, we would, where we have more home ownership, that we would actually potentially do fee simple disposition there. But in those cases, we would impose a land disposition agreement when we dispose of it, which would be specific as to what's permitted for development there, without, an amendment to the agreement. If they came back and said, well, this doesn't work, we want to redevelop it as something else, would the town agree? We could either agree or not agree, and if they couldn't make a go of it, we ultimately would take the property back. There'd be a reversionary right if they didn't develop in accordance with the land disposition agreement. So those are the tools that we would envision the town using in order to make sure that the development takes shape as we want it to take shape.
And what would the flip side of that be? Would the town also have a reciprocal restriction on its ability to depart from the original preferred scenario in the master plan when it disposed of a piece of it to a developer? I mean, if the idea is the developer wants to know what's going to happen across the street or down the road, would we then be limited once we sort of have the first sale of the property, that now we're sort of locked in doing roughly what we said we're going to do on all of these other buildings?
I would argue no. I mean, of course, that's something a developer would be free to bring up and might bring up, but my attitude on that would be, this is our current intention, but we can't tie our hands depending on how the future evolves, that different uses may come up that are more appropriate for the site, and the residential uses dry up, which I seriously doubt, but in any event, keep the town's flexibility on what we do with the rest of the site. So the master plan is an intention of what would happen up there, but we wouldn't, in my opinion, we wouldn't commit ourselves that would have to be the plan that gets implemented, because we've committed to the first developer that that's how the whole plan is going to evolve.
But in connection with that, though, presumably that would make it less attractive to a developer, right? I mean, if you're not going to have some restriction on the ability of a future town meeting or a future town government to change your mind and put a 12-story casino next door to your senior living center or whatever else it is, I mean, then I could see a developer. I mean, if it's true that the advantage of having a master plan is that it gives developers in the early phase some assurance as to what's going to happen in the later phases, they're then just sort of relying on the vagaries of the whims of the town or the views of the town changing over time. I mean, I would think that would be a tough sell. I mean, if we're trying to sell it as this is the plan, and if you want to buy in for the senior living complex on the right-hand side, you can be assured that the uses that we've decided here will come in the future, but there's no reason, unless we're going to be committing ourselves to that or restricting ourselves by zoning, we're really just kind of promising that, well, we won't change our mind.
I think that's right. I mean, but I think the hurdle of changing the zoning is not an insignificant one, that I'm guessing a developer would take some comfort in the fact that that's not something towns do willy-nilly, because it takes, at this point, a 2/3 vote. Maybe under the governor's plan that would be reduced, but for the time being, it's a pretty high hurdle to get to change the zoning. The other thing I'd say to that is I think we're going to be disposing of this probably in fairly significant chunks, so I don't ever envision that we'd be disposing of building 11 or just building 15 or whatever. It would probably be, certainly on the on the right side, the orange buildings would all be disposed of at once, and probably decent-sized chunks of the rest of the buildings around the quad would also be disposed of. So I don't think there's a huge risk as to those buildings. I think most of the future possibilities would be some of the more outlying buildings like Building 2 and Building 7 and the new construction buildings. So I don't think there'd be quite the same level of concern if the quad was more or less protected and was on a reasonably short timeline for redevelopment.
I'd just like to register a point here for us is, and maybe you can react to the idea, I am increasingly interested in the possibility of having a master developer rather than having the town manage the parceling of this over whatever time the town manages it, that we may actually be better. This is a $500 million real estate project. Not that it all has to be done at once by any means, but I've talked to enough people now where I'm beginning to see the potential value of a master developer. The only thing I'm not yet fully understanding of is the degree to which you can establish a collaborative relationship with a master developer. I don't think the committee's talked a lot about that, but if there's any, advice, reactions, or thoughts you have on that, I'd like to hear.
Well, I mean, one reaction is that's still up in the air. I mean, I definitely have heard expressions of interest in doing that kind of master developer disposition. I guess the question would also be like how broad it is. So, for instance, if you did one master developer for the core campus minus the cultural facilities, if the town wanted to keep control of those, but and within that, you could even put some kind of phasing. I mean, most developers would want to phase anyway because it's a lot to undertake. So it's natural that they would phase it. But so it's not an impossibility. I mean, one of the concerns was that the product types, at least between the CCRC and the rest, are fairly distinct, and so you add another layer, which means that most master developers would be subcontracting to another developer, adding another layer between the town and the actual developer of that portion. Not that you couldn't hold the master developer accountable, but it does sort of create a more distant relationship, I guess. So that's the counterpoint, but we certainly haven't decided one way or the other. So I talk about this phasing, but that has not been voted on at this point by the committee, so that's still a very active conversation. So I appreciate that input, Gus, because it is a valid point. I mean, that addresses some of Mike's concern, because you then say, well, here you have this whole chunk and you can control it and this is what it's going to be used for, at which point we're sort of locked in and they're locked in as well. So
let me ask my question about that, because the town doesn't really have the personnel or the knowledge to be able to be in the development business. And so that if we were gonna do that, how would we do that? How would we staff for it? What would we do? Would we hire somebody to run that for us, or?
Well, that's what our consultant is recommending, that we would, even if we dispose of it to a master developer, that we'd still want to increase our staff capacity to oversee this, because there's a lot that goes into this that the town would want to be active in making sure it gets implemented as we intend. So if you actually intended to do the disposition to separate developers, it might increase the staff needs even beyond that, because it would be a more active role. So, but yeah, in either scenario, we think that the town is likely to have to incur staff costs, and that's one of the early costs that the developers included in our financial projections, because it will be a burden on the town that current staff we don't think could handle.
More questions?
Yeah, one of the, just to share a comment to Bill, every once in a while on the weekends, I'll go up there, partly to see what people are doing up there, and partly just to stand there and look. And last time I did it, I reminded myself that the state hospital property, when it was running, added 50% to the population of this town. Now, I'm not suggesting that's where we're going here, but I look at the sheer number of buildings and the sheer size of it and say, when this was up and running, now, the town was smaller, but when this was up and running, this, I didn't check Richard Sorger's book to make sure my math is right, but probably 3 times as many people as we might possibly be contemplating moving there lived and spent their entire days there. And I look at the sheer massiveness of it, and you look down the quad on the inside and go, beautiful streetscape. And the first thought I have is it's like if downtown Crossing was suddenly ripped up by a cyclone and dropped in a field in Medfield, we say, look at this vibrant downtown, total square. Isn't this great? And it's like, downtown Crossing in Boston is great, but this big, huge complex, we would never have built that for ourselves. It's just a reflection, because it's like the magnitude and the complexity of this decision, trying to make something meaningful and useful out of something as massive as that, which will no longer be used for the kind of purpose, I don't mean in terms of mental hospital, I just mean in terms of just sheer housing people. It's such a downshift in terms of, I think, what we have in mind, that it's not a trivial, you all have struggled with this and tried to figure out how to make sense out of this and how to make economic sense out of it. It's a big deal. It's just a tough nut to crack because of the size and it's there.
And the other remarkable thing is just how beautiful a piece of property it is. So it's one of the nicest pieces of property in
Right.
town.
Absolutely.
I mean, high up, the views of the river, access to the woods. It's really a fabulous place. So.
Steve, let me ask another question at this point. I entered this whole process when your committee was formed with the assumption that we were going to be tearing most of the buildings down. So I've been pleasantly surprised that maybe it's possible financially to save them, because I like them.
Even the haunted one?
Yeah, I like them all. But what worried me about saving them was the cost of saving them. But I look at McCabe's different results, and it looks to me like she's saying that it's actually cheaper to reuse the buildings than to save them, so.
Yeah, that's kind of a startling conclusion, but she does say that, partly because she's incorporating the cost of the demolition, which would have to be borne by the developer as
Yeah,
an
and the historic
add-on,
tax credits.
and the loss of the credits and things. So, but I think from our perspective, I don't think we would recommend that we dispose of this in mandating that they be saved. I think the MOU really dictates a process where we create a level playing field, and so if someone comes in and says, we would tear them all down and build new buildings in the same footprints, and we like that approach, we could pick that if it turned out to be more economically advantageous to the town, as opposed to someone else who came in and said, yeah, I can rehab them all and make them into a nice thing. My personal preference would be to go for the latter, because I just think it creates a much more a unique site that I think a lot of people would really find to be pretty incredible up there, rather than tearing everything down and building a bunch of small new buildings up there. But all we're mandated to do is create a level playing field, and if that's what works out, then that's where the process would lead potentially. So,
I think that the layout and the look of the buildings is one of the big things that appeals to people in town, certainly. And if that can be
that was
saved in some
a
way.
bit of an aha moment for some of us. The idea that if you just proposed a redevelopment that sort of maintained, even if it didn't save all the buildings, sort of maintain that kind of campus layout, that a lot of people would say, oh, well, I'm used to that already. I walk up there, I don't mind what's there now. The idea of putting a ton of other additional new buildings all over the rest of the site, I think, is where people really stumble. And not everybody, but at least a good portion of people.
Steve, do you guys have examples of comparable developments? I mean, not necessarily that were former state hospitals, but developments that kind of look like this, that have this sort of scale and the kind of the mix of uses that you have. I mean, because it's I mean, I agree with what Pete has said about the nature of the site, what it looks like, and I also agree with what Gus has said, is that it's kind of a departure from everything else that's really close to it. And I'd be curious what sort of the research and what McCabe has found as to sort of similar analogous sites like this in places like ours, right? I mean, you can imagine a development like this that had a commuter rail stop next to it. You can imagine something like that, but some places 20 minutes from the highway. I mean, what sort of comparables have you used?
And you put your finger on the difficulty, is that it's not easy to find comparable. I mean, every property is so unique, and this one's fairly unique with the campus layout, and our location is different than a lot of others. So we visited several of the other state hospitals. I won't say a lot, but Danvers, Foxborough. I know that Gil has been out to Northampton, and Each of those is somewhat unique. I mean, some are heavier on other uses, some are heavier. I mean, for instance, Danvers had a large, what they call a Kirkbride building, and that they ended up, we met with the townspeople, the town planner up there to talk about that, and apparently the initial plan was to rehab the large Kirkbride building, but then the first developer went out of business, couldn't make it work. So the second developer came in and came up with the idea of gutting the entire interior of it and basically building a building inside that building, which was pretty unique. And they did that, but they also included a lot of other construction around the rest of the property. So they had a lot of new construction, residential development. So Foxborough was sort of a mix. Foxborough, they did rehab some, not all of their buildings, and so that was also a mix. We also looked a little bit at some other developments in other parts of the country where you might have had a large industrial tract of land and how they're redeveloped. It's hard to draw. One conclusion we drew is that having some kind of focusing feature is important to the success of these kind of redevelopments. So that hence the cultural facility. Others have been agriculturally focused, or they might have something else unique about them, golf course focus, but creating something that gives the community a certain identity is important, in our opinion, to the success. So I can't really point you to another one with our kind of demographics that was a home run, and I think that has been one of the challenges because we have a certain level of commercial space, which if we were in a denser community or closer to some better transit, it could have been probably a larger component of the plan, but given that we're such a bedroom community with pretty mediocre access to transit, it makes it a real challenge. So that's one of the things that's kind of driven a lot of the market surveys to say that the highest and best use here would be residential, and also kind of forced our hand into that. We did a lot of outreach to other types of users, but it always seemed to come back to that residential was the strongest contender, and others were pretty questionable. I mean, the arts facility we think is a nice draw, but it'll take a real commitment, at least for some people in town, to make that happen. But we think the whole town will benefit a lot from it. Seems to be a lot of interest in town in cultural activities. So.
Can you just talk a little bit about how the Arts Center would get financed? What's the town money involvement in that?
Well, none, actually. I mean, we voted to make that off budget, if you will, and have it, as well as any kind of park and rec facility, as having to stand on their own as far as getting financing, which doesn't mean the town couldn't finance it, but we didn't build it into our finances here. The one thing that I've worked with Gene some on working through is mechanisms whereby the historic tax credit, federal and state, could be utilized to help pay some of the costs of that, which is not the easiest thing because it's not geared for nonprofit organizations. So you have to do some structuring in order to make this qualify for the credits. But so that's I think a challenge that Jean can speak to now or at some other point. But I know she's actively looking at the finances and what kind of capital campaign it would take to get the funding going.
I think it's just important for the townspeople to hear that at the moment the town's not committing any money to it.
Right. I mean, ideally, if the town authorized a certain level of expenditure on infrastructure and developers came in and needed a lot less money, would be the ability to take some of that money and at least pay for some of the infrastructure-related costs for that. Some of what our consultant calls the horizontal improvements, walkways and all that kind of stuff, because there's a nice component of public plazas and things like that. So that some of that money could be directed to that.
And I think there seems to be an agreement that the Arts Center would actually increase the value of the rest of the property so that the town really does have a financial interest in its success.
I think that's fairly universally felt on the committee, at least. So, I mean, one of the challenges on that, I guess, just while we're on the subject, is that the town would not do that development. It would be done by presumably a nonprofit selected by the town. Now, I don't know what process the town would engage in, but Jean's group is very active, and I think a lot of people have felt that Jean is the face of that effort. But if we were to do that, I mean, normally you would have to dispose of that under a 30B public procurement, which I know you're all pretty familiar with. When we did the Allendale project, the town actually decided that the Medfield Community Development Corporation was the vehicle that should do that development. And so the town got special legislation, home rule petition, to allow the town to dispose of it to a town-sponsored nonprofit rather than putting it out to bid. We're not terribly fearful that there'll be a lot of groups clamoring to do that redevelopment, but it's a step that's time-consuming and probably a nuisance to engage in, and so the town might want to think about that as a possibility. The selectmen sponsoring home rule petition to authorize a disposition to a town-affiliated nonprofit, which would then bypass the need to do a formal 30B on that.
We did that with the animal shelter as well.
Thanks, Mark. So there's some precedent for that kind of approach, so I'll throw that out there.
So on that line, I mean, to the extent that it's correct that it would enhance, that whatever the Arts Center is would enhance the value of the overall project, how much does the value of the overall project then become contingent upon Jean Mignot's capital campaign?
Well, that's
Not that I don't have great confidence that she's going to be successful, but if the idea is that you're marketing this to developers saying the linchpin of this site is the Lee Chapel Arts and Cultural Center and its 3 buildings, and here's the amount of time you have to figure out if that's ever going to actually happen.
I don't think I'd ever market it as being the linchpin. That might put our necks a little bit too far into the noose. But I mean, I think it's a valid point that we've thought a lot about, that doing that earlier would make that enhancement of the value more real if it's just a hope, and you're a third of the way through your fundraising. Well, that may seem pretty real. If you're just basically at ground zero, people will say, well, that's nice that you think that, but show me the money. So it's a valid point, Mike, but there's no easy answer. I mean, I think the enhancement to the value, the earlier you are in the process of doing it, the lower that level of enhancement is. If it's a fully functioning facility, it's obviously much greater because you can see it and appreciate how it's running. So it's a very valid point.
And do you have an estimate of what the infrastructure costs are? I mean, if you were to say, just obviously you wouldn't look at it necessarily in isolation, but if you were to look at it in isolation, just as a thought experiment, what the infrastructure cost would be just for that?
For the Arts Center?
Yeah, like just to get that up.
Well, that's an important one because that's a question that's been on my mind too, but we haven't been able to get to that level of detail with our consultant at this point. But that's because we're focusing on the core financials. But in order to have a discussion about phasing and things, that to me is a really important number. One of the ideas that I had, and it was based on ideas of other members of the committee, was to allow the disposition of that southeast quadrant, which is intended to address some of the senior housing needs, which could be peeled away from the rest of the campus pretty easily and done fairly quickly. It's going to have the same virtue, I guess, of Lot 3 and Hinckley being a little bit separate from the core campus, and an easier thing for developers to digest and impose on them the condition to run the infrastructure up to the edge of the core campus, which would be would really soften the infrastructure requirements for the cultural facility, because you'd have the bulk of the utility lines already running up to the edge of the core campus at least. So that's one idea of how to activate that part, which is probably less dependent on having the cultural facility actually functioning, but also use that as a way to get some of the infrastructure paid for to benefit the cultural facility. So there's a lot of different factors in how we phase this.
And have you received any input from developers or just through the consultant's analysis that confirms that the mix of uses that you've identified here will be seen by, because presumably if you're not going to go the master developer route, and even if you did,
yeah,
it's likely that different pieces of this will be developed by different people. So someone developing a residential condo building is probably not going to develop the CCRC.
Right.
And so what input have you gotten to suggest that these are seen as kind of complementary or additive uses apart from the benefit from the Arts and Cultural Center?
Well, we haven't gotten any yet. One of the to-do items for me is to reach out with a description of our tentative plan to some of the developers who participated in our roundtable to kind of engage exactly with that issue. Not just the mix of uses, but also the level of intensity of the use, to see if they turn around and say, oh, we were in, I mean, there was a ton of interest at our developers roundtable, and a number of the developers followed up afterwards and kept saying, anything we can do, when are you going to roll it out? But whether when they see the number of units and the mix of uses, they say, no, that really wasn't what we had in mind, is something that we at least feel that we want to test at some level, just to kind of get a bit of a reality check. So that's something on my list to reach out to some of those developers with that question.
Those would be developers that would be probably taking on a piece of the project as opposed to a developer that would see the whole site.
They could be either. I mean, these are bigger developers who could easily bite off this whole project if they wanted to, so, if we wanted to put it out that way, so.
Steve, this is a question I've had for probably almost 2 years. From my perspective, one of the best things that your committee's done over the 2 years was the development of the catalyst list. And I've never quite understood why it's been kept so hidden, and I assume there's a reason. But the catalyst list is really the specific idea, as I see it, is the specific ideas around the commercial development that could possibly have gone there. Can you, to what extent does that catalyst list play into any of this planning? And if it doesn't, can you help me understand why we're not kind of pursuing those
I don't think
ideas?
the catalyst list is a secret. I think we posted the minutes of a lot of the meetings that we held on the website, if I remember.
Yeah, no,
right.
but I had recommended that when you have when you go to Medfield Day, when you have a public meeting, put that up as one of the big things. It didn't go up, so I assume there's a reason why.
Well,
I've
I
never
think
understood.
One of the reasons is there wasn't a ton of interest, and I mean, if there were some great catalyst leads, that would have been something to talk about. But in fact, a lot of the meetings ended up, we met with brokers, for instance. That was one thing. We met with a couple different brokers who did a lot of commercial stuff, and mostly what came back was, it looks pretty good for residential. We don't see any use for commercial up there.
Oh, I thought, how did you get I thought the catalyst list was you went to people who had ideas of what they wanted to do up there. Is
well, a
that
lot
wrong?
of it was word of mouth, and so it was a mix of things. So we would hear leads from somebody in town who might say, well, I know so-and-so might do recreational facilities, or somebody else who might do some other type. Educational was another one we explored.
Okay.
So, I mean, Gil, you may want to talk to some of the other catalyst things, because you went to virtually all of them.
And some of the ideas, I thought too, I think this was one of the more innovative, can I have the mic? Is that the correct wording for this?
No.
I'm Gil Rogers. Yeah, I think some of the ideas are getting in now. For example, the idea of CCRC was an idea that came out of the Catalyst meetings. Or assisted living, which is sort of one aspect to it. Also, a number of commercial and retail ideas came out of the Catalyst idea. For example, we've had interest expressed in a distillery. Mm-hmm. We've had a number of meetings that connected the agriculture that's all in that area to the campus, such as a farm-to-table type of restaurant, or that type of thing. We've heard interest in, I guess you'd call it small office space. It's for, people that are consultants, or they work at home, or they work in the area, but they still want to have, they might be lawyers that have independent practice or a partnership, and they're looking for office space, that they could rent on some reasonable basis. Not a big building, but enough space and conference rooms and that type of thing. And then I think we heard quite a bit of interest in different types of building renovation. Companies, I mean, we talked to maybe 2 or 3 companies that specialized in renovation of old buildings, mills buildings, for example, or schools, that type of thing. And that they specialize in taking an old building and converting it into some use, such as residential, or a combination of residential and retail, that type of thing. So I think, I do agree with you, Gus, that I think that a lot of the ideas that came out of the Catalyst meetings, and we have them all, that they're kind of continuing on all the time, are getting into the plan. And your point is, I think, that we should maybe make that more evident, make that clearer, that is having influence on it.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it. Let me give you some just flat feedback about the big picture. The master plan that you've just described sounds reasonable in terms of what you've allocated. It sounds clinical. This many units here, the CCRC here, the Lee Chapel, to Gene's credit, because I know more about the thinking that's gone into it, that has this there's a little bit of sparkle coming out of the lower corner, but the rest of it, And I'm thinking about when the taxpayers are asked to approve this master plan and buy into it, I don't want you to, I'm not saying you need a marketing brochure that's gonna really wow them with the sizzle and not the steak, but there's nothing here, this is, as you said, the nicest piece of property in Medfield, and there's very little here that kind of would get the casual observer from town who comes to the vote to say, do I like this plan? Like, I like the yellow, versus the orange, or, there's nothing that really grabs people that says we're not telling you we're doing this, but this is the kind of thing we're trying to do over here. When we say this building here is gonna be used for a distillery and other things, it's gonna be like this, it's not coming to life. And you got a bigger issue, I know, on the finances. It's not, you're gonna have to be able to do that first. But it doesn't have the spark that I think is gonna inspire people to really get excited about it and support it, and that worries me.
Well, part of our undertaking is to actually get the master plan drafted, and we've been talking about how we engage the public and what kind of marketing we have and what kind of images, visuals we have associated with the plan. Gene's got some really terrific ones of the recreational facility, which when you look at, you're like, yeah, that looks super. So it's really visually compelling. It's expensive to do, though, so creating visuals of the core campus of what it might look like would be nice, but if you want to appropriate a few extra $1,000, we'll hire a graphic artist to do that.
It's not the pictures, it's a concept. To pick up on, when I first heard about the distillery, the thing that mattered to me was, hey, that's cool. And I wasn't in that red building. It was when I think I first heard about it, it was, gee, we'd like to put the distillery in, and we'd actually like to grow our own grain on the DCR property right out by the building. That's cool. Whether that's the right thing to do or not, I'm not going there, but that's a cool concept. Not everybody's going to have a farm field right outside the place that you can go. And it doesn't have to be a distillery. It could be, farm to table.
Well, the farm to table
So
restaurant is exciting for that same reason.
Right.
But it has its challenges. We can't guarantee that we're going to find somebody to do a farm to table restaurant, but it's a perfect site for it. We'd like to enable that. So we had meetings with some agricultural users to explore that. But it's sort of connecting the dots there, of having the agricultural user and also having the restaurant. So that's going to take a little bit of effort to pull that off, but it would also be another great thing which would tie into the cultural facility, creating a destination up there with a lot of cool things to do. So
when you go to the car show,
Yeah.
the concept car, the one you could never buy but would be the one you really want, that's kind of, I'm looking for the equivalent of the concept car for the state hospital.
Brandy?
Hi, Brandy Erb. So the communications subcommittee has been challenged by the same approach, and we've taken it from a few different aspects. One is we're working on a walkthrough of the property from the viewpoint of full completion, so that you will be led on a tour of sorts through the property, and using your imagination, and also probably some video aspect of it as well. You'll walk through, and we'll take you on a tour of what's been created.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one thing, because in our mind's eye, we've been working with it for so long that we see it. We know what it can be. So we want to convey that to the public now. So that's one item, and we just started working on it this week. So it's in a little raw form, but it should be ready probably next week. So that will go out. Also,
Let me check you there for a minute. Does that mean you have those ideas all figured out yet?
well, our proposed scenario is what it's based on. So, as of right now, that is what it's based on. There's still more public engagement.
I'm going to push on this because I
No,
want
go
to
ahead.
make sure I'm getting the right.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not pushing for the distillery, but when you do that video, much as I like distilleries, but when you do that video and people go on that, I don't know, virtual tour or
Right, yeah.
video enhanced tour,
Right.
they're gonna see this building and they're gonna see, this is a this is, we were thinking could be a representative thing would be a distillery here, and over here, I see the farm-to-table restaurant. And over
Correct.
here, I see the artist studio where the artists in
Yeah.
residence can go, and right here is where the vista out over the back meadow is where so-and-so painted the original thing, or where King Philip came, right, whatever it is. It's gonna be at that, you have those ideas?
Well, to some degree, I might not have the King Philip reference in there, but it's
Write
the
that down,
walking
Steve.
tour will include things such as the continuing care. So the person who's walking through will say, "Oh yeah, my folks moved into this building, and I should go visit so and so because they moved into the cottages in the Arboretum area, and it's beautiful. And I should have snapped one of those up before they all sold out." And then moving along, it's a running commentary. It will not pick up on every specific use, and obviously, since we don't have the budget to create graphics of everything, but we know the buildings we're talking about, so if we can show a visual as we're speaking and walking, I think that will acquaint people, because not everybody's familiar with every single building on the campus, even if they've been there. And if they haven't been there, we want to acquaint them with it. The walk around and the vistas. So it'll touch on uses for every building. That is true. The Medfield TV has also put together, with Lucille and Gil, have been doing some compilations of videos that will take us from the beginning till now. So we're bringing everybody back up to date so they know exactly where we are now, and introduce the master plan by video. You want to include? I'll let Lucille continue.
I think the only thing that, Lucille Fisher, I think the only thing that I wanted to say is that the plan has come out of input from multiple surveys and multiple public meetings. We didn't just come up, the committee hasn't just come up with it. This is what the public has told us they want.
So I'm gonna push back again.
Go right ahead.
I understand that the public told you what they wanted, but I think even the committee recognized that when the public gave those inputs, there were not price tags associated with those things. So what I'm getting at is, you got a far bigger issue of making sure the numbers do work. So, but what I'm getting at is showing the public, it's great that you're bringing what they want, but you also have to see the thought process that took the things that people aspired to have and understand what you did to it to get it to be the thing that works in practical terms and financially. It's not really that,
I think we get all, we get all that. Certainly we know we have to have the financials to back us up, and and we did give the public some financials when we had our meeting in May. There was financials then, and in the meeting previous to that, which was in February. So it's not like they've had nothing. Do you know what I mean? But we're refining them now, and I'm gonna stop right there because Steve and Gil and maybe better to answer from here. But we've taken the public's input, and they were very excited at the May meeting. If you were there.
Yeah, I was. I'm envisioning
That
who's
was
gonna
down
come.
to 2.
I'm envisioning who will come to the special town meeting to vote on the master plan, and some will simply want to know that they have open space and a place to bring their dog, and others, some are going to want to know that there's a house that they would like to live in.
That's the challenge.
And
It's a
others are going to want to
balance.
know that this thing's all going to work financially, and that
Right.
it's,
And that's the challenge
Yeah.
the committee has had. It has not been easy
Right.
because there are so many different.
so my comments are in the
Wants,
spirit
needs.
of saying, that's who's going to be showing up.
Oh, we're
and-
aware.
Okay, okay, thanks.
I guess another area that I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about is the long-term financial results from this proposal. You'd mentioned it a little bit in terms of the diff financing, that we could because it's going to be revenue positive to the town from the property taxes that we're going to get from the development, that we can use that to finance the infrastructure maybe. But in the long run, the town's going to make money on this, is the way that it sounds like. Is that correct?
That's certainly our what our financials show. I mean, the financials have been built to show a 20-year horizon. So at some point, as the DIF financing gets paid off, then the tax revenues go seriously positive because of the fairly light demand for services up there, and the fact that it's designed not to have a lot of school children. So the long term looks good, assuming you get past paying off the DIF.
And the DIF is mainly to pay for the infrastructure costs.
Right.
That's what it is.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's a statutory scheme, basically a private-public partnership for dealing with, to provide infrastructure is an inducement to get development, as opposed to a TIF. So,
And the borrowing on the DIF is just secured by that site. It's not a general obligation of the town.
You could do it either way, but
Okay,
our
okay.
idea would be it would be secured by the revenue stream coming from the town.
My reaction,
property.
with my limited understanding of DIF, just to be clear, Pete, is the town is paying for the infrastructure because they're committing future tax revenues to fund this upfront amount of money that's being provided to the developer. So in looking at a DIF, this is not a magic way to get no new low-income tax credits or something like that. This is a means of providing for the funding of this upfront loan through means other than Prop 2.5 controlled debt. But we would be paying for it. So the advantage, as I understand a DIF, would have more to do with the fact that we could tap this revenue stream. If we make the business decision that we want to pay for the infrastructure by taking town funds and actually putting it into paying for that infrastructure, then DIF is a potentially attractive alternative to allow us to manage the cash flow by not having to pay the debt back until we're collecting the taxes. But the point is, we're putting that money, the town is putting that money up for the infrastructure. The advantage of the DIF is it allows for that obligation to be covered through a cash flow that the town does not yet have but will have with the property.
Yep.
Doesn't save you money, it just gives you an alternative way to acquire that money to pay off the obligation.
I guess, but I look at it a little bit differently because it's a revenue stream the town doesn't have. So when you look at the town's profit, if you will, on the taxes versus what you're paying for additional expenses up there, there's a line item of profit. So if you will, it's taxes over expenses. So you're paying the bond off with that increment. So it's not like that you have to tax the rest of the town to pay for that. It's new revenues that are coming to the town that are in excess of the expenses required. At least that's our financial.
From that
It's
site.
it's in a, I just learned because I've gone to your meeting, so I don't know any more than I'm talking about than what I was able to comprehend. I look at it as a credit card. Basically, as a town credit card that says, look, you can put an expenditure on this, there's a limit to the credit card, and it has to be paid off in a certain amount of time, but basically you're putting it on your credit card and you're paying that credit card off in installments as the tax comes in from that to offset the balance.
Right, but it's as though you bought your bicycle in order to do your paper route, and so pay it with a credit card. You earn the money on your
People
paper
at home are
route.
going to go nuts with this analogy, but I agree with you. That's right. Yeah, I agree. If you never built the building, you would never have the taxes to pay off the DIF that you provided in order to build the building. I agree with that. And my only point was, it's not like magic money or something. It's money that you're committing would otherwise be revenue. If you could find a way to get the developer to cover the infrastructure costs,
Right, better
all
for
those
everybody,
taxes
yeah.
would be revenue.
Exactly.
Although it's
I
not revenue
like
if
your
if we
analogy.
don't do something with the property. Yes, Mark?
I assume that somewhere there in the background is the fact that the original disposition agreement with the state has requirements as far as what we do to dispose of the property, as the so-called partnership, and that you're well aware of that, and that needs to be factored in and explained as well.
Right. I mean, the beauty of the approach that I laid out to disposition is the disposition price would be zero, so there will be nothing to share with DCAM. But in theory, if and that's one of the reasons to do it that way, because if we just said we're going to put in the infrastructure and then sell it, and so then a developer comes in and says we'll pay $10 million for it, as Mark says, we get half that money back. We get $5 million. The other $5 million just went to the state. So that's why to sort of have the net purchase price to me is kind of important, because we are going to lay money out if we decide to do that. We certainly don't want to end up having half of the profit going to the state. So,
Steve, have you guys looked at, and if you haven't, I would suggest that when you talk to the developers in this follow-on diligence period, you do, sort of how much of this plan has to hang together as a whole? I mean, I know that concerns have been raised by various people that the empty buildings up there devalue the rest of them. And so that, to your earlier point, that one of the advantages of the master planning approach, as opposed to sort of a more passive approach to redevelopment. One way to do it would be to kind of put a for sale sign up there and let the ideas come in, right? Let the market tell us, let people come in and say, I'm interested in doing this, I'm interested in doing that, and react to those as they come through. One of the advantages, as you noted, of the master plan is to try to redevelop everything, and then sort of the rising tide will lift all boats, right? The redevelopment of one building is a nicer building next door to this one, so that's more valuable. But I'd be interested to know, if you don't know already, or if you do know, to know now, sort of which pieces of this plan would potentially be divisible from the others, and which of the uses might be less sensitive to having otherwise well-kept but abandoned buildings there, right? I mean, can you slice off pieces of this and say, well, if the ultimate judgment either of the board or of town meeting is that the master plan as a whole is too much to do, or it's not in the best interest of the town, could you take some of what you've done here and kind of slice this into different pieces and say, all right, this is what we're going to do now, and leave the rest to a future idea, a future developer, a future interest, or just to stand as long as they'll stand?
I don't know the answer to that precisely. I mean, I think what we have thought about a lot is that the core, the quad, if you will, it sort of hangs together, and it's a great open space, but you gaze across at the buildings on the other side of the quad, so that those are, seem to us fairly well linked, that it's hard to imagine leaving half, one side of the quad undeveloped and the other side developed. When you get to the buildings like the former state police, which I can never remember, is it S or R, Bill?
It's the
S building. It's a little down the hill, it's a little set apart, and it just seems like that's separate enough that you could probably leave that a little longer, and to let things percolate, because those are the harder uses too, because they involve more commercial related things, as well as the West Hall, I guess, which is also set a little bit apart, and that's we have slated for the inn, which I think we recognize is going to be a challenging use and may not happen, but we'd probably want to mothball that for a while and try to let the interest percolate on that. And as to those buildings, maybe at some point down the road, we do just what you said, which is put the for sale sign on them and see what kind of ideas come to try to redevelop those in ways that we haven't necessarily contemplated. But we feel like once you get the quad redeveloped, those will become a lot more attractive as far as opportunities for reuse, and give us more options for what other things might happen there.
Steve, you mentioned the Arboretum is probably the one that
Right.
hangs by itself.
Yeah, the Arboretum down where the cottages are down the front, because they're not as visually connected to the core campus. So thanks, Randy.
In fact, the whole front of the property, you can think about it, is screened by trees from the back, what's in the back. So, I mean, there's an argument that could be made that you might want to look a little closer at the whole front of the property to decide what's the optimal solution for it.
Do you have a sense of the, and I'm sorry if it was in here, I didn't see it in within the financial model, but do you have a sense of the demolition/rehabilitation costs for each of the buildings?
It's a pretty broad brush. I mean, demolition, we just have basically the buildings are all pretty similar in construction. There's some that are different, but the bulk of them are, same vintage, same type of construction, and we have a square foot price, which isn't that different than what Gus quoted earlier. The rehab, similar. We have basically a range of prices for rehabs. It's hard because these buildings are somewhat unique. I mean, they were set up as almost like, say dorms, or I don't know how you, but, you know, with small cell-type rooms that will need to be significantly reconfigured. So it's hard to come up with good comparables on what the historic rehab costs of these will be. So we're applying basically a more, rule of thumb from other projects that we've gotten pricing from for historic rehab projects. But that's probably the single most variable cost, just because the buildings are unique, and even up there on the campus, some of them are in better condition than others, that might be cheaper and easier to rehab than others.
Let me throw out an idea that sort of occurs to me from Gil mentioning that there was an idea for maybe office building, office space. I know the original DCAM state plan that they did 10, 15 years ago had the R building being dedicated for office use because of the fact that it was recently rehabbed, or most recent, it's one of the two most recently rehabbed buildings at the site. And I guess it was built as almost like a prison, so that it's just a series of small rooms down corridors, and they thought that those could be offices. So there's that, and I know that McCabe has trouble with the R building and the cafeteria building, making them work financially because of the plan is to demolish both of them. And I never understood why you were demolishing the R building. I didn't attend those meetings where you discussed that. And then when John Thompson took me on a tour and I saw the inside of the cafeteria building, I mean, I don't like the cafeteria building from the outside. It's this 1960s ugly building to me, but when you see the space on the inside, all of a sudden I liked it. And John Thompson also told me that it's a very expensive building to demolish because it's built, the way he put it was the other buildings, you could basically push on them with a backhoe and they would just collapse because they're just masonry buildings. But the cafeteria has steel in it, I guess, and so that it would be more expensive to take down. And so I'm just wondering, why take down those two buildings?
Well, they're different but related. I mean, the food service building it's just anachronistic. I mean, it's a much later construction, and it kind of sits right in the middle of the quad and blocks the views and
But that
is it
interior
really-
space could make a very interesting performance space or something that I could. I mean,
Gene,
I-
you want that building?
Yes, I do.
Well, so, I mean, that was really the gist of the debate, was it was not historically significant and occupied a big chunk of the quad that could otherwise be a nice open feature. The R building was a little different because it was, and that's a question I know you had raised before that we haven't yet really debated, was that was not because it was difficult to rehab, because as you say, it's one of the in better condition than a lot of the buildings. You'd obviously want to take down all the 15-foot high chain link fence around it, but it was also a later construction and blocks a lot of the view sheds to the north, which is the biggest reason why people didn't like it and wanted to get rid of it. So it's a trade-off, admittedly, because it's a building that presumably could be reused, but had some serious negative effects on the view shed from the quad. So, I mean, that's something we
It's just a
can.
question of how much do you value the view?
And that's a tricky one, because there's no easy monetary price for the view and the integrity of the core campus. But it's certainly something we can revisit, because it's not, it wouldn't have a huge impact one way or the other on the plan, presumably, but would generate a few more, I guess the question is what we would use it for, so generate a few more units potentially. But
I don't know if this is a valid observation or not, but one thing that I sensed was that in the early stages, when the question was which of these buildings are still good enough to preserve, you kind of think about what could we do with this whole site and which buildings can we kind of keep. That has you first starting with what you want to do with the site, and then how can we make the buildings that are most suitable still here. As soon as the technical feasibility of preserving most, if not all, of the buildings became a possibility, the thought process goes differently, like the conversation we just had, which is, well, there's this R building, And the reason we're talking about office space up at the north side of the campus looking out over the meadows isn't because that's where we put office space, it's because that's where the R building was. And it's a pretty good building, and it seems a shame to get rid of it. So it's almost like the buildings, once it becomes feasible to keep them all of a sudden it's the buildings that dictate the purpose rather than can we find a good way for these limited number of buildings to support the purpose that we actually thought was a good purpose for the thing. And it's not a criticism or anything, it's just that I've sensed a difference in the thought process once all the buildings were potentially savable. Then it's how do we make that happen is the first step, and rather than I think before it wasn't that way.
Well, I don't think it's really dictated the uses. I mean, you could use those buildings for whatever. It's that's been dictated more by the market study is what you could use it for. Now, the secondary question is if you feel like you've already got saturation of commercial use, then what other uses do you have? I mean, the idea of performing arts space in the cafeteria, that's a potential idea we could certainly explore. And then the R building, I mean, it could be a category where you mothball it for some period of time, because that was another possible approach to that, is just set it aside. It's not in bad shape, so don't demo it right away, just let it sit there. So that got some serious discussion as well, so we're certainly willing to revisit that. I probably wouldn't immediately program it for more units, because then that just drives up the unit count, but maybe preserving it for some other non-residential use might be beneficial.
I mean, following up on Gus's point, though, at any point did you or the consultant sort of, just as a thought exercise, sort of think about the site with no buildings on it? Just from the standpoint of, okay, if the buildings weren't there, what would you do, right? Because it seems like once you do, and I think this is a great observation, but once you say we're keeping the buildings, then you have this kind of quad structure. Right, and you kind of have to have buildings that can fit in the quad. You have to have uses that would fit in those big buildings, where you kind of eliminate saying, okay, we're going to carve off 10 sort of mansion-like lots in the back, right, which won't be very dense, but we're going to cut that off. That's going to be a high price for that piece over there, but we're going to have the open space over here. I mean, you do limit yourself once you start in saying, okay, we're going to keep all the buildings. Now, I'm not saying limit yourself in a bad way, but then you kind of have to come up with a plan that looks like this one, as opposed to a plan with sort of the Lee Chapel in the middle of something else. Right. So did you do that at all? I mean, just sort of as a...
Well, so the original
conceptually?
plans were demo everything plans. I mean, other than the Lee Chapel, that was exactly some of the original plans we explored, but nobody felt very good about them. It had just what you said. It had a bunch of residential buildings at the front. It had some high-end lots at the back, and it basically developed the whole site and contained a lot more units than anybody wanted. So, I mean, you could, I suppose, take that and scale it back, but then the same issues come up. You've got more pressure on infrastructure costs because you've reduced the number of units. And I think a lot of people just felt like it wouldn't, it's just going to be a mega residential development without a lot of character to it. So it's entirely possible to do that. It just didn't excite too many people, that a lot of the character and what people like about the campus layout, it's a constraint, yes, but it's also in a lot of ways a virtue, because it's a pretty cool experience when you walk around it. So it's kind of like you just throw that away and say, well, let's just start over and do a subdivision. I mean, it wasn't a lot of excitement for that alternative. It's possible, but it didn't inspire too many people. So back to what Gus had said about getting some pizzazz, part of that was try to appeal to people about imagining how nice this is. It's kind of like the South End versus the Seaport. I mean, you can have the new glass and steel buildings, or you can have the old brick row front houses. I mean, which do you prefer? Some people prefer one or the other, but given that we have that neighborhood up there, it seemed worth trying to parlay that into something a little more unique than a big residential subdivision.
Is that the committee's view that was the only other alternative was a subdivision?
Well, I mean, the problem is, when you look at all the market studies, the use that comes out is residential. So it wouldn't have to be a subdivision per se. And in fact, it wasn't a subdivision. It was a combination of some single-family lots, high-end, and some more like townhouse buildings and other types of buildings. So it had some differences in types of architecture and approaches. So it wasn't just a subdivision, but it was just all new construction, like with some 2, 3-story buildings and some single-family homes, so it was a mix. But most people didn't find it very inspiring.
I think another factor was the realization that when people look at that site, they think about the real estate and physical assets up there. An aha moment at least for me, was the realization that the historical tax credits financially are extremely valuable. And probably are more valuable than the physical buildings up there. So that's when my mind started flipping on, let's see what we can do to mine that financial asset, which is historical tax credits. You tear the buildings down, they go away. In fact, if you do minor demolition, you can destroy the historical tax credits. We've been warned by our consultant not to do that.
We saw amazing examples in Lowell, and Lowell is very different.
The Lowell's completely different.
Yeah, but amazing what they did with the whole.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it comes back to kind of the earlier discussion. It's you could imagine a site like this being extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily successful. It's harder to imagine that kind of site where it is. I mean, if you could pick this up and you could put it next to a train station, or you could put it, half an hour closer to Boston, or you could put it somewhere like that, you can say, well, this would be. But if that's where it was, it would already be that, right? It would already be redeveloped,
Right.
and it would be. The state never would have sold it to us for $3 million. So.
Fair point.
What would you say, just to kind of come back to the earlier question from Gus, I mean, apart from kind of specific, what I'd call kind of sub-goals, or an attempt to be responsive to what the various surveys revealed about the interests of the people who responded to the surveys, I mean, what do you see, what does the committee see as kind of the principal benefit to the town of this? If you had to say, okay, here's what the town is going to get out of this, what is the principal benefit of this particular master plan?
I mean, principal benefit's kind of hard to articulate. I mean,
What are some of the benefits?
yeah, I mean, I would say it's mostly that laundry list of benefits that I laid out in response to Gus's question. I mean, those are, in general, I guess the question is, what do people envision being a good, now that we own it, and the whole point was when to control it, what was that control all about? And I think the control, different people could have different views of it. Part of it was to stop the 440 unit proposal that they thought DCAM was gonna push, or something even more dense. So that's always a bit of a bogey out there that was what people reacted negatively to. So we've always had that in the back of our mind as our unit count has crept up towards 300 units. Was how are we just going to do what DCAM was going to do? So control was for a purpose, and in our minds it had a lot of different factors flowing around it. I mean, part of it was reaching our affordable housing requirement. Part of it was keeping some open space up there and being able to control that open space and providing for more open town access to the property. Part of it was potentially to get increase to our commercial tax base. Part of it was just to try and see if that project could be turned into some positive economic benefit to the town. So there were a lot of strains of different town goals that we referenced in it, but and one of our undertakings in the master plan is going to be to have a section addressing your guidelines more specifically and sort of laying that out in a more comprehensive way. But I mean, those are some of the things that come to mind. Maybe other people have other ideas of what they might throw out there.
Brandy, can you just find the microphone to make sure people can hear you?
Especially now that we're all live.
And I've confirmed we are live,
Very exciting.
Does that mean they're sending comments in to you?
maybe.
Another important point was diversification of our housing stock, so that there were places, and this also addresses back to the housing production plan put out by the town, go back to the senior housing that you had mentioned, but also housing for millennials, downsizers, people who want to rent versus buy, at different stages of life. We have big old houses here, and some people want something smaller or want a condo where someone else takes care of everything. Yeah, so that's, I think, a really important part, is that it addresses different housing needs.
Thanks, Brandy.
To add to the answer to the question, just from a personal standpoint, at a whole different dimension, if we're able to do this, we're able to take an institution, an established thing in Medfield that for over 100 years was used for one purpose, and without destroying it, turn it to another purpose. And by doing that, we honor the thing that it was, but not just like putting it in a museum to keep it the way it is. It's we've turned it into something yet again that still has value to the town, that hasn't forgotten what it was. I look at some of the uses you have, oddly enough, Gene, not the Lee Chapel in this case, but the artist residence. And I think about the heritage that Medfield has had of artists coming here, and I realize if this happens, we're putting artist residences in one of probably an artist could go in any direction on the compass and walk 300 yards and have a setting to do something. And that's kind of like pretty neat. The fact it's a hospital, I do like the idea that we're doing something along the idea of assisted living or something, because it's not making it the hospital it used to be, but it's making it a medical facility. That's what we need now, and we're still using a portion of it for that purpose. And those things don't show up in dollars and cents, but they show up in the value to the town of doing this if you can do it well. When I talk about that sizzle, there's a piece of that ought to get in here to get people to think about what Medfield means to them and how this preserves something around that.
That's good, thank you. Before we get too tired, I wanted to actually visit the issue of 40R, because this actually was a 40R
We usually go to
hearing.
11:30, Steve,
I know.
so we're just getting started.
I've only had to charge the laptop once.
So this past week, last week, we had a pretty fulsome debate about 40R, because that was one of the things that we had been pursuing. And in the end, at least as to the core campus, we voted to abandon the idea of doing a 40R district. We looked hard at all the pros and cons of it. The pros being really the biggest things were the two incentive payments. You get a bonus payment when you adopted the zoning, and you'd get an additional bonus payment with each building permit that was pulled. And the second thing being it would potentially help in a MassWorks or other types of applications for funding. That was a hard one, because that was pretty intangible about whether we'd even ever get one of those and how much it would matter that we had done the 40R or not done the 40R. On the other side of the ledger, some of the biggest factors were the inflexibility of 40R. Some of the feedback we'd gotten from DHCD on our draft was about being more specific about including X number of, or X percentage of affordable units in every building on the core campus, every residential building, which tied our hands a little bit. For instance, the CCRC, or assisted living, in our Catalyst meeting at North Hill, they said, that they just hadn't found a way to really do affordable units at that type of facility, because it's a big challenge, because you've got a big service component and it just doesn't line up very well. So, that's just one example, but it was a pretty important example, because if we were forced to put affordable units in all those buildings, that was going to be a significant detriment in our mind to that potential use. Not to mention that some of the other buildings might become low-income housing tax credit housing with a higher degree of affordability. Others might then have a lower degree in order to keep the balance that we've set out. So it was potentially going to interfere with that ability to manage the affordability around the rest of the core campus. So in the end, I think people felt like there were too many constraints. I should also mention that they looked dimly on senior housing. So when we had first met with them, they said, well, you can do senior housing. It's just going to be up to you to do it. It can't say anything about in the bylaw, which we were okay with. But then they started pushing back when they learned that we actually were intending to do senior housing, and they weren't too excited about that. So it appeared that they were just going to have a lot of fingers in the pie and constraints on it. And I know that when I was here in an earlier meeting, you said, what are you going to do if you decide against 40R? we're still gonna do the overlay zoning, which is gonna look pretty similar, but it'll have some important differences because we were manipulating that pretty heavily in order to meet the 40R minimum density requirements. So once that constraint is relieved, it makes it a little easier for us to draw the districts in ways that are more logical. So in the end, we abandoned the 40R plan, although we didn't totally abandon it because we did raise the dreaded subject of Lot 3. And it seems to make sense from our perspective if we went the route of doing residential to potentially do a small 40R district just limited basically to Lot 3 because it fits pretty well there, and you wouldn't be worried about the constraints because it's one project and it's all going to be done together, so you don't have the same concerns that we had up at the core campus. So I throw that out there because we still are on that timeline that we could do that, and it's not mandatory either because we have the underlying zoning, as we talked about, that would allow for the commercial use. So I throw it out there for discussion because both for that and for Hinckley, just to get a little more guidance of whether you would think it's useful for us to keep going with the 40R district just as to Lot 3, number one, and then number two, what you would want us to do about the Hinckley property and Lot 3. I mean, Lot 3, we understand your process that you're going through. I guess the Hinckley property, we just want to make sure that, I know you've had other sort of efforts in that regard to deal with the Hinckley property, so we want to know whether we should keep including it and keep working on it or not, because at this point we're sort of trying to get our plan to congeal, and if there are parts that we don't need or want, we won't focus on them. We'll focus our energies on the core campus. So you may not be ready to make that decision, but at least I'll throw it out there for.
I'm ready to talk about at least part of that tonight.
Do you have your charger for your laptop?
Here we go.
Sure, but I don't know if Pete, you want to ask, because Pete's got to recuse himself from this.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want
Yeah,
to
you
wrap
wanna-
up the
Okay, so
three-headed monster portion of the meeting.
Steve,
and
there,
then return to the.
Okay.
so let's come back to Lot 3, but there's one thing you haven't talked about. That's the land south of Hospital Road.
fair enough. So the other side of Hospital Road is the Sledding Hill property, we call it, has the possibility for 12 acres of development on that property. The rest of it has to remain, I guess, agricultural-related uses. I think is that right, Bill? So far I mean, it got caught a little bit in the discussion about what was going to happen at Lot 3, but generally our feeling is that that's a potential site for recreational uses there. We didn't designate that to be a particular recreational use, park and rec or otherwise, but it was for recreational use, and if the town decides to dispose of it directly to park and rec or do some other disposition approach, I guess that's up to the selectmen and whatever committee is in charge of implementing the plan. But we sort of viewed that as distinct from the core campus. That would be potential for that recreational facility of whatever kind the town thinks most beneficial. So that's still part of the plan.
So what's behind my question, we're going to talk Lot 3 and Hinckley soon enough, but what I've been wrestling with is how important is it for us to keep the land south of Hospital Road with this committee? And my whole interest here is there's nothing in the master plan that's really that prescriptive about the full 12 acres in the first place. And I'm not doing it to be mean or anything, I just don't see the business connection that's really driving that. And I actually, from 2 years of having watched the work and what has gotten attention and what hasn't, and the magnitude of that challenge on the campus, a piece of me says, I think everybody would be better off including this committee if you knew what you had to figure out was the campus. That's the master plan piece. To the extent that the land south of Hospital Road is not particularly well defined in terms of even a specific use. I mean, I doubt we'll have a lot of disagreement about the idea that some portion of that is for sports, but sounds to me like it's really a question for the town to decide, should it be commercial or should it be for Parks and Rec? And then there's another 6 or so acres that we haven't really figured out and that you don't have a recommendation for anyway. So the idea I'll throw out is that both of those, well, we'll get to lot 3. My position will be that actually all of that property should get pulled back for the town to figure out how to dispose of. And you all go forward focused on the campus itself, the real tough nut to crack.
And I don't think that they're actually focusing on the south of Hospital Road
That's my
anyway,
point.
so.
I mean,
Yeah,
we
that's
had
my
a vigorous debate about that earlier on, but that's been, the feeling has been that's been resolved, and we also voted to put, there wouldn't be a park and rec on our budget, so, or any recreational facility on our budget. So once you resolve those two issues, it's really just become rezoning for that possibility. Bill, you might know better than I, but what is the zoning on that side of the site? Yeah, it's agricultural. So our feeling was, we would keep it in the plan and recommend that, those potential uses would be, dealt with by the town in the future. And then we would zone it to allow those potential uses. So that's the only virtue in keeping it with us, is we keep it within our zoning, because right now it's gonna be agricultural. So if you don't rezone it now, you gotta go back and do
Bill,
it.
including the 12 developable acres? What's that zone? So it's
It's
developable,
all agricultural, so if
Okay.
you decided you wanted to do something other than agriculture, whether it's a rec center or a commercial, any other commercial operation, or even housing, I mean, you're gonna have to rezone it, I mean, at least to
Yeah.
12 acres. And I would point out, it's not clear to me that that 12 acres is one contiguous parcel either. It conceivably could be 6 acres here and 6.
Yeah, it's not an identified 6 acres. It is up to 6 acres.
You pick the 12 acres.
okay, I didn't realize that. That's,
I mean,
okay.
I would stretch it, and I would say, you pick those 12 acres and how many, whatever size parcel you want, wherever you want, you still have to consider about how do you get access to it, and how do you,
So,
split it
yeah.
up. But-
So my point on that is that this has been a 3-year master planning committee effort. The definition of what we should do south of Hospital Road is what it is.
But they're not looking at it, though, I mean,
But,
they,
yeah.
other than to throw, I think, to accommodate the reasonable concerns and interests of Park and Recreation, they did in fact throw up a building there. I mean, so if you looked
Yeah.
at theirs, but I mean, it has not been part of their discussions, it's not been part of their financial efforts.
But we did give some thought to the location of where it would be best to site a building and things like that. So my attitude would be, we'd include it in the plan unless you had more urgent need to do. I mean, even if you do have more urgent need, there's nothing, we don't control the property. I mean, we're just writing a plan. So I would not delete our section about it, because I didn't do a lot of thinking about that. I would just write up those sections and leave them in the plan, and I think our zoning is gonna permit recreational facilities there, so that you don't have the zoning problem.
The genesis of that question was actually the first draft of the outline for the plan didn't have a section for the south of Hospital Road, so that's what triggered my thinking in this direction. The practical issue I have is, to the extent we can unhook, and I'm not trying to create a problem for you if there's a problem, but to the extent we can unhook that land to make it actionable as the town is prepared to act on it without going through any other, that doesn't mean we wouldn't like your inputs or wherever you think the building should go, that's not that, but speaking plainly, if when I moved here in 1995, there was a park and rec facility that was on the list of priorities. My kids were very, very small. Now they're either in college or out of college. And I'm actually looking for practical ways to eliminate barriers that will, if it makes sense to the town to move ahead with a park and rec facility, we actually don't have any further hoops that are unnecessary to get to. So there's a method to the madness here around being able to take action without having other things hamper it.
Well, again, we don't feel like we're a barrier. You're free to do whatever you want with that whenever you want. We would just include it in our zoning as permitting a recreational use, and then if the town decided to do something else with it, they'd have to rezone it for a different use, but at least that would be what we would propose. We'd write up our finding on it, but again, you're free to do whatever you want, whenever you want.
So, okay, so it boils down to just the question of zoning.
That agricultural zoning is very sketchy to begin with in terms of its validity, so.
Is that good news for us, Mark, or bad?
Well, I'm just saying, I wouldn't say, oh, it's agricultural, because it's been raised over the years that is just not.
There's no challenge.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Basically,
it's
a
10 acre
10-acre.
zoning. So first of all, agriculture is an exempt use, so it can go anywhere as long as the the necessary acreage, which is a heck of a lot less than that. And a 10-acre zone would be very hard pressed to legally justify that.
Large lot zoning, it exceeds 2 acres, which is the max that the state will allow as a minimum lot size.
And we don't want to
The
develop
original
four
thinking
houses.
probably was to
in
try
any event,
and
so.
retain farming, but it's been on the books for a long time, but it's,
So one more question then, and this is a question, sincere question to you or the committee. When I looked at that, and I looked at your surveys, when they first came out, you said the one thing that had the greatest agreement on was a farm stand. And actually, that point, when you picture a farm stand, I think I can find the,
Open space, recreation, and housing.
I think I could find the message, but perhaps it was qualified as what people actually want. It wasn't, well, it's interesting, because I remember reading it, but the point was, the thing I read was a lot of people wanted a farm stand. Now, at first, when I read that, I was picturing this little thing with the 5 pumpkins on it and some tomatoes and a sign. It's like, that's the major point. But when I think about South of Hospital Road, and I think about the land that might not be used for a park and rec facility, and I'd get even more excited about it if it didn't have to be contiguous with that land. And I think about some of the comments like Alec had commented about, gee, can we put greenhouses down here? And if the intent was agriculture, whether there's any potential, and you know me, I'm looking for commercial development opportunities, but they don't have to be industrial. Being able to put some sort of, a Medfield Volante Farm Light kind of an operation. I know you've already talked to some people, so you may just say, yeah, great idea, but nobody wants to do it. But that's kind of
No, I
where.
wouldn't say that at all. We did have some good conversations. One of the challenges is that most of the agricultural land that we would consider using is actually the land that DCR is going to retain. So whatever, we'd end up being like facilitators trying to work out an arrangement where that land got leased to a farm stand or something that we liked. Then the question is, well, where do you build the building? And we did talk about putting it on the campus at one point, but I don't see it on our plan, and I don't remember what we decided, if we just forgot about it.
Because it was on the Great Lawn, and we decided to leave the open space on the Great Lawn open.
Yeah, well, I was thinking down as part of that 12 acres. Gil, wasn't some of the best soil down, I think it was you that said, somebody said some of the best soil, I thought, was down that side.
Let me have the microphone a second.
There was somebody that wanted to put greenhouses where they would have people with disabilities doing the work. There was going to be a combination. And I think when I talked to them, I don't think their greenhouses even needed to be on dirt, basically. They could, there was actually something on the news the other night where they're growing things in containers now.
There's a lot of interest
It's the
in,
marijuana place.
there's
No,
a lot of,
no.
there's a
No,
lot of
it was
interest in
vegetables.
agricultural uses up there in the hospital. And of course, that, if you think of what defines the hospital, the agriculture and the farm was one of the major things that defined the hospital. A couple points about that. I get called, and I've done quite a bit of work on the agriculture thing. I get calls, I got one last week, of a person saying, hey, what's going on up there? That they're interested in a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, which is another business model for agriculture. So I think the Catalyst effort has brought out a lot of that, that interest, and it's always there. So I would think of agriculture not as being de minimis. I think it's a very important part of the hospital, and particularly because you've got 70 acres of prime agricultural land all around the hospital. That's part of DCAM, but then it's going to be transferred to DCR, but probably under the purview of DAR, that they'll probably be involved in it. They often do that for other state properties and stuff. So I would think that agriculture-related things, not just the distillery, but other things like that, could be a very important part of the overall development.
So anyway, I didn't want us to get off into designing what you've been spending 3 years trying to design, but my point was, if that's land and we can unhook it to where it's easier, now you've raised the zoning issue, which is a good one, but if we can get that land unhooked so that we're not dependent on a particular meeting or something else to have to, then it just gives us the ability to move faster on something if the opportunity is there to do it, that's all.
Well, so, I mean, we did discuss at some point the possibility of doing something like that on the second 6 acres, if 6 acres was park and rec of the 12, because there's a lot of agricultural land there as well. And the other is we do have the idea of a couple of restaurants, which the hope would be they'd be some kind of farm to table, which would tie into the agricultural use. And I think we do have right in the middle of it, the idea of the sheltered workshop, which would be something like Suzanne Sino was talking about. So that also could potentially tie into some agricultural uses as well. So we haven't totally forgotten it. It's just we don't have a farm stand sitting anywhere on the site. And if that's an agricultural building, it could presumably go on the leftover 6 acres.
So we're going to go to Bill and then Jean. Gil, can you pass the microphone back?
Gil?
I'm sorry, we're going to Bill and then Jean.
I just wanted to point out that it really is unhooked now, if you think about, you know, the whole land disposition agreement pretty much, you know, unhooks that whole section. And it's not like, I don't know, how can I say this delicately? I'm not known for delicacy. It's not like it's going to impede anything that the town wants to do or delay anything that the town wants to do, because the committee is going to bring their plan sometime several months from now. I would say probably 3 months, maybe roughly from now, you know, up for a vote. You're not going to be doing anything with that parcel of land between now and then, and I would suggest that you let the committee just finish it up. It's not like it's locked into the master plan forever, because it is basically, you know, pretty much separated even in the land disposition agreement. So if, you know, let the committee finish it up, and you're free to do whatever you want after the master plan is either accepted or rejected.
So here's where, again, part of where I'm coming from on this. I'm trying to visualize the special town meeting where the master plan is up for a vote. And if it's a two-phase vote that says, well, we want to vote on the portion of our plan for south of Hospital Road, and we want a vote on the campus, then that's great. If it's a single master plan and has both pieces of property and it doesn't get approved, what happens south of Hospital Road?
Nothing.
It gets locked. Well, does it get locked, or do we?
No, there's nothing.
More importantly, what happens to the whole committee?
Well,
What happens
yeah.
to the whole piece of property?
We commit ritual suicide.
That's right.
We reset the clock, Steve.
So I guess what I'm saying is,
That we won't be doing.
if you, the worst possible scenario is you wind up back at point zero, you
Right.
still can do whatever you
You're
want.
no worse
with the
off.
property.
If it
You're-
fails, you're no
nothing's
worse
changed.
off. Right.
So-
The failure to change the zoning doesn't do anything. It just doesn't change the zoning. So I guess my only question to you was whether there was anything that you would prefer to see in addition to the recreational facilities on that. If you said, well, also we'd like it to be any commercial use, you could tell us and we'll include that in our zoning, but.
Well, I guess because I've always staked that out. I had a more fundamental issue that says we've got 12 acres of developable property, and I've only heard a story for 6 or 7 of them. And so I heard silence on the other 5, and that was of concern, particularly because I think we sold, or we redesignated the Olson property to throw more acreage down there. So we've actually taken developable property and turned it into open.
Right, you did
or
a
farm-
swap.
yeah,
You did a
then we
swap
did a
effect.
swap. So we actually invested in that, and if we're not fully using the asset, because we have a deliberate reason for not fully using the asset, that's one thing. If we're not using it just because we didn't think it through, or we didn't nail it down to something, that's what I'm actually reacting to.
Again, I mean, it's sitting there for use regardless of whether our plan addresses it, doesn't address it, gets adopted or not. It's there, and there's 12 acres that you are able to develop, the town is able to develop.
Right.
So the only thing we're looking at is implementing a zoning change to allow that to be activated. Because right now, all you can do is, there's no zoning that prints anything other than agriculture.
So I guess my suggestion would be to rezone it in the ways that gives the town the greatest flexibility to do whatever might come down the road that
A super
appeals to
district
us.
that would allow anything else.
Well-
I mean, because we have to pick and choose sort of what the uses would be. So I guess, I mean, you could say, well, you could do it residential, commercial, industrial, whatever you want, but that would probably raise some opposition, I'm guessing, as being too.
Can I offer a
like,
suggestion
open-ended.
here, Gus, on this point? I think with respect to that piece of property and the recreational use in particular, there's going to be 2 things I think that are going to happen in the next year that will inform this much more so than even the outcome of the master planning process. The first is going to be the outcome and the response to the RFP for Lot 3 that we agreed last time that we were going to issue. I believe that's an irreversible decision that cannot be changed.
I thought you were
So
gonna
whatever
try
we're
to
going to
get out of
discuss,
it,
we
Mike.
can discuss. The second is the fate of the future of the Dale Street School
All right.
and what the feasibility study is going to show. Because if that feasibility study shows, number one, that we need a new school instead of a remodeled school, and two, that the best location for that school is someplace other than the corner of Adams Street and Dale Street, we're going to have another big chunk of town-owned land to decide what to do with. And then, in light of those two data points, what happens with Lot 3, what happens with the Dale Street School, the Park and Recreation Commission, in conjunction with the Board of Selectmen, are gonna have to figure out the best location for a park and recreation facility. I mean, the commission has expressed a view as to where they would like it to be. I don't know that that's necessarily the view of the town in general as to where it ought to be. We are hopefully going to be doing, over the course of the next year, a townwide master plan, which will consider things like where the Parks and Recreation facility ought to go and what the master plan would be for town facilities. So I would think as to that, I know for myself, I would not be inclined to try to do anything with that 12 acres before those other things that are already further along happen. Or we have some sense, because there's no sense in thinking about a recreation facility there and moving in that direction if the best bid on Lot 3 is for a commercial recreation facility and Parks and Rec decides they want to have their recreation facility someplace else other than there, then we're not going to build a third recreation facility in town. So I would kind of let those other processes play out before we move ahead and leave it, let them finish the work here and then do what we will with it after we know what's going to happen with those other things.
So I
And
agree
you
with.
limit the zoning on it to just the recreational zoning then, that they're talking about?
I don't know if we have a recreational zoning district, but I mean, I think it would be.
No, but our
commercial
overlay
or
would
overlay,
potentially
yeah.
allow that use.
Municipal district.
Municipal district, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think whatever.
We could also
they-
do a more broad commercial definition of the use too.
Can I just make a point, 2 points, I guess. One is to pick up on a point that Pete made, that when I studied other hospitals, one of the lessons that I think I learned is that you want to have flexibility in the plan. And an example, a very concrete example, was Northampton. And they spent, I think, at least a year designing a master plan, went through consultants and all that. And a company, I think it's called Electro-Optical, which makes advanced sensing systems for the military, came in and said that they wanted a 100,000 square foot building for their research and manufacturing of their equipment. And so what they did at Northampton, there was a piece of property kind of across the street, similar, and that they took that property. And it changed the whole economics of it, because then they had a large company, kind of high-tech company, that then became a very important base for the, for the property. So I think one thing you want to do is you don't want to pin yourself too much down, because you want to have the ability of flexibility to take advantage of that if somebody comes in and offers that. And I think that's one of the things the Catalyst Committee. The other thing I'd like to mention too, and this is for everybody watching this program, is that on the goals and objectives discussion that we had a little earlier, our first video is a discussion we had about goals and objectives and how the plan, how the layout of the plan satisfies, and we had, I think, like 12 specific goal objectives that we're trying to achieve. And we make that connection, as explicitly as we can. And then the second video that we did, we had Andre LaRue from Smart Growth. Do you know the name?
Yep.
Okay, he's the executive director of it. And he gave a presentation, which is on the second video, about smart growth and what's the concept of smart growth and how it applies to the hospital. And I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, and we're going to start broadcasting that next week, is to look at that. Because it's not 40R, it's what the good concepts, underlying concepts are about an integrated community that has all these recreational features, living features, arts features, and put together in one development. So those two, and I would encourage anybody that's interested in this, and particularly leading up to the special town meeting, that those are the first two of a series of videos we've put together to bring everybody up to speed on some of these ideas.
It will broadcast the first one, goals and objectives, tomorrow on Medfield TV. Next week will be this podcast.
Gene,
I want to shift the subject back, if I could, just for a minute, and ask, given that special legislation would be required for this home rule petition for the Cultural Alliance, which is committing to the fundraising for the chapel, given that that would be a requirement, what's the process for initiating that, or when is the time, or who do we follow up with, or when can we go? When can we do this?
Usually it's done as part of the disposition article. We just tack it on that if deemed necessary or desirable, that the Board of Selectmen is authorized to petition the legislature. So it's part of the disposition. It may well also be that there wouldn't be anybody else out there besides you. For instance, we went through a disposition process with Dwight Derby House. And they, at the same time, they were setting up the nonprofit. There was nobody else interested in taking over the Dwight Derby House, so. It just depends. If there's a need to go to town meeting for disposition, which if you're gonna transfer property out of the town, there is that need, then you would simply tack it into the article, just to have it there.
So that's part of the special town meeting then?
Well, whenever it comes up.
I think it would be after that. It would be at disposition. So it would be a future town meeting.
But that's actually an interesting question, because one of the things that we have been kicking around is how much authority for disposition you want to consider building into the special town meeting articles. For instance, to save having to come back and get another vote a year later, is whether you want to get some kind of authority for the selectmen to dispose of some or all of the land that we're planning for uses consistent with a master plan or something like that, so that you've got the power to go ahead once you're ready to do it without having to go back to town meeting.
Mike, can I come back to your comments before on the south of Hospital Road? The first point, I think one thing I agree, if we have the townwide master plan start this coming year, I would hope that the townwide master plan would result in some specific recommendations on where we would best put put various facilities. The one concern I have, I said when I first moved here in '95, the Park and Rec facility was number 5 on the totem pole of investments, and even though there aren't 4 other investments on that totem pole already, I'm not convinced that Park and Rec isn't still number 5 on the totem pole. So I'm coming a little bit from the standpoint that says, well, if we wait for Dale Street to get sorted out, we're pushing this entire decision out, I think, 3 to 5 years. So as a practical matter, we have added to the 23 years that I've already seen this get pushed out, we're gonna add on another 5 years. So my position, the reason I would like to figure some of this stuff out and nail it down, even though we could always take a few more years to see if there isn't an even better idea out there, is this just experience I've had that said Park and Rec has been looking for a facility for more than 2 decades now.
So I don't think it's 3 to 5 years. I think the feasibility study will answer the question of whether we need a new Dale Street building and where it should go.
I think we already know that. It's
We
it's
don't
not
know.
gonna be at Dale Street. It's
Well, we
gonna
don't
be
think so.
behind
but
the,
They still have to do the analysis of it, and I mean, I think the expectation is that's the way it's going to come out. But I think going into the process, it's not a foreordained conclusion.
So that'll
I
happen this
think it
coming
is.
year.
I mean, there's no
Well,
way that they're.
it is, except the state requires us to spend $1.5 million to analyze it. So I'm assuming from the state's perspective, was funding 40% of this project, that they don't think it's a foreordained conclusion, and we have to go through the process. I mean, I think the likely result is, given what we know with the Dale Street building, it's unlikely that the renovation costs of Dale Street are gonna be cheaper than a new building.
Well, yes.
And so, but we won't know that. I mean, if somehow the feasibility comes back and says, no, you're better off renovating
I
it,
mean, that's not gonna happen. Dale Street can't be reused as a school.
almost certainly true. But again, we won't know that for sure, because obviously we have to go through the
We
feasibility
have to go
process
through
if
the
we want the
process
state to
with
pay
them, yeah.
40% of the cost of the new school. So for practical purposes, we can't act as though that decision. was
That's
made.
1 year.
That's 1 year.
Okay.
And then in that year, what I would hope would happen is that as part of preparing the townwide master plan, that the Parks and Rec Commission will kind of analyze the issue, survey people in town, figure out where the Parks and Rec building ought to go, whether it ought to be in the same basic complex where it is now, but in a new building, whether it will go where I think they have said for the past several years they want it to go, up on the sledding hill, or whether there's some other place it could go in combination with something else or some other option that has yet to be explored, because I think it is, it's kind of the last municipal building over which we have some sort of control and where it could contribute to other benefits to the town, whether it contributes to a kind of enhancing what is the kind of the mini municipal district that starts with the public safety building, whether it's going to be kind of an anchor up at the hospital, it's kind of a municipal building that's up there that will kind of open up a lot of options up there, or something else.
So that'll happen in year 2.
Yeah, next year.
No, year 2, because you're gonna have to, you won't know what the Dale Street answer is until sometime next year. Then Park and Rec is gonna wind up, you can't ask people what they think, where they think it should go with places that maybe aren't feasible. So
I
they're
think
not
you
gonna be
could.
able to start asking that
I
question.
think you can. I think you can ask that question concurrently. I don't think there's any reason they can't be doing that now.
It might, given that Kevin Ryder's in the back, have you already done any of that research?
No.
Okay.
But I don't think there's any reason they can't. I mean, you could do the research and get 1, 2, 3, 4, and if for some reason 1 is taken off the table, then you go to 2.
Well, even that's not in an isolation, because if the townwide master plan occurs, if Dale Street opens up, I think there'll be a very powerful argument that some of that at least should be senior housing. And so you actually have competing needs that might land on the Dale Street. My point is, there's so many moving parts. My interest is only to not have all of those moving parts and the continued deliberation push an answer, at least an answer for Park and Rec out another 3 to 5 years. That's really what I'm coming
I
from.
get it, but I think the more moving parts you have, the more reasons you have to say no to doing something in the short term, right? As opposed to saying, look, we have a couple
It's
of.
worked for 23 years.
Well, I mean, it has, but I think if you have to resolve these kinds of gating issues first, once you've resolved them, then you're in a position to move ahead. Otherwise, you're basically saying, well, several things could happen that could change this, that could make one place better than the other, but we're just gonna go ahead because we wanna do it now. So we're gonna pick the best spot that's available now, as opposed to, this is a building that's gonna last hopefully for 50 years. How long has the FAF Center lasted?
1920.
Okay, so the FAF Center has lasted almost 100 years, right? You don't want to, from my perspective, even though it's been 23 years, those 23 years are a sunk cost. We're not getting them back.
I agree.
So I don't see
I'm not
why
trying
we
to, I'm
should
not
let-
trying to get us to go back in time. I'm trying not to have us put
Right.
another 23 years.
But I don't
go
see why
forward.
that should be a justification for making a decision with the location of a 100-year building in year 1 of 100 instead of year 3 of 100. If you can make a better decision in year 3, that's all I'm saying.
John, did you have a comment still? Can you get the microphone from whoever has it, please?
In the interest of having people who may be watching this at home come to a conclusion that this is a consensus of everyone who's been familiar with the hospital project, I would like to say that I am not at all convinced that the plan is sound and that this would be anything like the time to go ahead with a plan that has so many exposures for the town of Medfield. We're talking of a $500 million to a $1 billion plan here, development project. You know, oh man, when the question was asked, what are the benefits to Medfield? We can see a lot of benefits to perhaps to investors and various kinds of low-income housing and tax credits and for historical purposes, et cetera. But look at the exposures that Medfield will have. They are enormous. And you wouldn't find, I think, a wise investor saying that a plan like this is timely, has certainty to it. I mean, we've gone, mind you, from housing projections by McCabe Advising Group from as high as 397, and now we're slightly under 300 units. And the costs of education, I know they've been talked over with the Warrant Committee, but the costs of education, as we know in town, are enormous and will grow exponentially, not only from the projects up there, but from the great success and the good work that the Housing Trust Group is doing. So, and turnover in housing, with my generation and the generation behind me by one or two, are passing on. Those houses are being turned into housing, which we know from the number of children in town, who are not necessarily in school yet, but we have a huge number of children coming of age to go through Medfield schools. Every way you look, there's a problem with this. The water and sewer meeting we went to the other night has $10 million that has to be spent in the next 5 years. It goes on and on. So we've spent 2.25 hours here talking about a plan which people may be enthusiastic about, but I certainly am not. And I would hope that the people out there who value land, value the kind of town we have, want that to continue, want to pass it on, will attend town meeting. And I seriously doubt you're going to get a 2/3 vote that's going to change the town of Medfield in fundamental ways and in very practical ways that we all feel, you know, which would be some of the essential: water quantity and quality, sewer upgrade, traffic, educational quality, and you can go on. There's a long litany of reasons to be against this, and to see that those buildings, in large part, come down, and we spend the $15 million or thereabouts to do that. And then we have a property that is not only wonderfully scenic, but useful, offering playing fields, walking paths, and doing what it should do, which is to increase in value so that those who are coming after us will have something to use and to benefit from. So that's a minority opinion here. I know on this, with regard to the committee, and I do value the work that they've done, and I think that they've been committed and have done unbelievable hours for the town. But the end result is, I think this is magnificently untimely. And when I didn't hear anything but weak responses to what are the benefits from the town from Mr. Nolan and Ms. Erb, then you know, I thought that a word might be said that the town should be approaching this with great caution.
Okay, thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Jerry?
Jerry Potts. So I want to go a little bit on what Mike was talking about as far as timing, and I certainly support Park and Rec in this town, and they've done amazing things, and my kids have certainly benefited from those programs. The one thing I worry about, and even this state hospital committee sort of going ahead of a town-wide master plan, it's sort of like the housing production plan. When we got the housing production plan and that was finalized, then a whole bunch of really good things started happening. We saved time. We made better decisions in a more timely way with the plan. And so I want to echo what Mike was saying, simply that a town-wide master plan, just please, we so desperately need that. We have so many really legitimately, and every time I hear them, I go, I'm in favor, and then I hear another great, I'm in favor of that. And that's because they're all compelling cases, but it gets us to the point now when we're looking at, you know, the facilities, they're talking, you know, $42 million over the next 10, 15 years just to, so I just would feel better if we had a plan. And that plan, I think, will take a lot of the input that the Medfield State Hospital Planning Committee has done. But I think their job would have been easier if we had done the town-wide plan first. So just to say, please get a plan if you can first. It always saves time. It always saves money if it's done right. So,
Thank you.
So that's pretty much all I had. We are. We're hoping to come back to you in a month, sometime in February, we hope, when our master plan has been drafted, and we're gonna look at your input, incorporate that, and then come back and have a further discussion, and then perhaps if need be, a third meeting after that, in order to get you comfortable to the point where you feel like you can support the plan and think about scheduling our special town meeting. And in the meantime, we have the whole financial discussion ongoing with the warrant committee representatives to keep them progressing in pace. So unless anybody in the committee has anything else to add, I guess you may want to turn to lot 3, but as far as our presentation, anything else?
Okay, then if
No,
we're,
just I'd like to
I'm
just
sorry,
say
can you
that-
find the microphone, Gil? Thank you.
No, just I would like to say that in looking at other towns and the process they went through, one of the most important things is to get your full support, to get you behind it, all of you, and not just a kind of neutral administrative way, but more in a passionate way, that you really like what this is and you see what the future is. And we hope that what we can do is show you kind of the benefits and convince you that this is a really good idea, and it's a good idea that we have to move forward with now.
Okay, thank you. And so I think that we are ready to go on to lot 3 discussion at this point, and so at that point, I'll recuse myself and let you guys,
But yeah, as we wrap up, I do want to extend, my thanks to the committee and I think you've put an enormous amount of time and work into this. It's not over yet, and I think that, at least from my perspective, I am approaching this from the perspective that all things being equal, I'd like to be able to support the plan that you proposed. I don't know if all things are equal, and so there's a lot of deliberation, and I think caution is a good word that Mr. Harney used. I think most of our viewers of this meeting at this time probably have heard what Mr. Harney has to say about the hospital before. I'm going to guess if they've stayed with this meeting till 9:20, they are probably regular viewers of Medfield town government programming. And so I kind of look forward to continuing to think about this and continuing to analyze this. And I think I will say that I agree with you that from my perspective that I'm only going to go forward with this if I can support it enthusiastically. As I said to you 6 months ago, I'm not going to vote to call a special town meeting to oppose the plan that you've put forward. If I'm against it, I'll be against calling a special town meeting. I don't know where I am yet, but I look forward to continuing this discussion. It's not a decision that can be made in one night. And so I think we need to keep thinking about it, and I value the input from everyone on the committee and everyone who's here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
Gus?
So, two things. So, lot 3, and actually I'd like to talk about Hinckley in light of the memo that Sarah sent out.
I will just note before that, though, that Tony Santori and the Senior Housing Study Committee will be coming in next week. And so we can talk about Hinckley, but I think we should talk about it when they're here, too.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Well, I actually think this week's discussion is shorter than we sometimes have on this topic. And you were talking out to the viewers. For those people out there, you need to understand, Mike and I are doing our best to increase the viewership of Medfield TV's viewing of the Selectmen's meeting. First off, let me get to the bottom line. I actually think that this is an appropriate time for us to pull Lot 3 and Hinckley back from the committee, because in the case of lot number 3, you and I are in a convoluted enough process that I don't think we're doing the committee any. We've heard what the committee's had to say. I don't think we're doing the committee any favors to kind of keep that, and we are going to have our hands full figuring out exactly how to orchestrate that process. The reason I think the Hinckley property may also be appropriate, after I saw the memo that Sarah passed out from COG, I read that, and aside from the sheer magnitude of the process to move on Hinckley, again, I'm being consistent in the sense that I would like to eliminate all unnecessary barriers and hoops so we can start to get things done. If there's one, besides my interest in finding ways to commercially develop property in Medfield, the other interest I have is in eliminating all of the unnecessary, reviews, convoluted turns and twists and turns and things that we do, because I don't think we move fast enough in almost anything that we do. And with the benefit of 23 years of watching it, I can guarantee you 75% of that is unnecessary or no value. So I have a predisposition, particularly at Hinckley, I have a predisposition because I think the seniors would like to know that something is happening, and I actually thought we were on track to demonstrate that. And that memo at least said, well, there's a few railroad ties you're gonna have to leap over in order to do it. There was another piece in that, though, that concerned me, and that had to do with the confusion, the questions that COG was asking around who is exactly doing what. Is it the state hospital, master planning committee that's gonna do this, or are we doing that? I realized that just because of the way this is all structured, we actually do have confusion over who's got the lead and who's doing what. The other the other point that I read in the memo that had some concern for me was their recommendation around the Hinckley property, in that it was not affordable housing. It might not be appropriate for the Affordable Housing Trust. I think my memory is correct on that.
The author of the memo is here, by the way.
Yeah, well, sorry.
If you have any questions.
So my point around that is the Affordable Housing Trust Charter is to promote affordable housing and community housing. So it's not just affordable housing. The seniors, I think the senior housing that we would put on Hinckley is probably qualifies as community housing. Now, if it's affordable and then there's some market rate stuff, but my point is, if the Affordable Housing Trust isn't kind of guiding that through, I think we need to, maybe that's not the right answer, but that was kind of the assumption that I had made around how this was all gonna work. So basically, I would like to start to simplify some things. This is a place where you and I have complexified it enough on our own as it is, that my own position is, I think that this would be a good time for us to take those two lots back so that we can move, and so we also don't drag the committee down, because I'm concerned about having focus on the campus, and that's the place I think is gonna make or break the recommendation.
Right, and so I think, I mean, and Courtney can speak to this, and we should have this discussion next week, though, in
Yeah.
fairness.
Yeah.
Because,
You coming next week?
apparently you'll be back. I think the issue really is around the public purpose of the disposition of the land. And so I think if it were already in the trust could probably do it. Is that a fair?
No.
No, oh, okay.
Part of our concern.
Microphone?
Oh,
Yeah, microphone.
Reminded of hot potato. So part of our caution in how you handle the disposition and who handles the planning moving forward. Frankly, it's just a side note because I know that A, there is some contention about it given some warrant articles that have been submitted, and B, we are somewhat concerned that if the lot is while community housing is in the charge of the Affordable Housing Trust, community housing itself lacks a formalized and well-accepted legal definition across the realm. So part of our rationale is that if we end up doing if the town ends up doing a market rate housing development here, the Affordable Housing Trust itself is not necessarily the best arbiter because of restrictions that are placed on Affordable Housing Trust to do affordable housing, capital A, capital H. So you're 80% SHI. So in your quest to eliminate barriers and try to get from A to B the fastest, that's part of a recognition that it may create limitations in the future as to how the land can be disposed of.
So let me back you up.
Okay.
In the charter, when the community housing was added, as a practical matter, what impact did that have on your understanding of what the Affordable Housing Trust?
Should there be legislation in the future for a home rule petition, for example, or because there are additional funding programs?
Preservation Committee, too.
There are, like CPA, for example, should you adopt it, CPA does affordable housing up to 100% AMI instead of 80% AMI. So the thought was that if the Affordable Housing Trust were to work with additional funding subsidies or additional programs in addition to just the state's 40B, but also some of the other tools in the toolbox that work for workforce housing or community housing, that we didn't want to preclude it from being part of the trust's activity. But because of what we're proposing because of what's being proposed at Hinckley doesn't meet those definitions, conditions, what we're saying is if your goal is to avoid additional regulatory complications, a swifter route may be to avoid it's to do it as a market rate.
So next question, there is an affordable housing trust, which is a financing vehicle.
Yes.
And then there is the Affordable Housing Trust Committee, which has some of the best real estate developers that I've seen volunteer to help bring about real estate projects. Do the restrictions on the activity of the Affordable Housing Trust restrict the activities of the Affordable Housing Trust Committee?
I believe you have a affordable housing committee, which is different from the Affordable Housing Trust from the fund. So I believe that they are actually two different.
If your question is, are people who are members of the Affordable Housing Trust precluded from participating as developers, the answer is probably yes.
No, are they precluded from overseeing a town-sponsored development of housing which is not affordable?
Not necessarily. Our issue is just, from our perspective, it's mostly about when money changes hands and how property transfers.
That's not the part I care about. The
That's
part I
what's
care
not
about.
who's gonna be in charge of this project should
Right,
it pass.
right.
So the
Yeah.
fundamental issue with, it's the misnomer, if you will, of calling this the Hinckley project, or the Hinckley property, because it's not all the Hinckley property, and it's not limited to the Hinckley property, it's picking up a piece from the senior center. So it's creating a brand-new lot.
That part is okay. I'm
Okay.
more worried about the
That's
management
as
of this thing.
That's as time-consuming as anything, particularly given the fact that
Right.
surveying needs to be done in the middle of the winter with snow and all, so.
So I was reacting in your
Yeah.
memo to, I think somebody else should do it, and I'm going, these are some of the best real estate
Yeah,
developers,
our
I
note
think,
is
that have stepped
is
forward.
not to say that they cannot handle it or that they should not handle it. Our note is simply to say that the selectmen should think about it. We have no
We
recommendation.
could, if town meeting, if future town meeting were to support this redevelopment, I think we could appoint a small
Yeah.
redevelopment committee to oversee the project on our behalf.
Absolutely.
I don't
And what I'm-
think we
what
need
I'm-
to have an existing town committee. If the question is who's gonna be in charge of overseeing the developer, meeting with the developer and all that, my view would be that we would appoint like a 3-person oversight committee to oversee this particular town project, if that's
That's
the way it's gonna
exactly what
go.
I was trying to avoid. If we move ahead with the campus, when we had a meeting or two ago, when I talked about pushing for Hinckley, I said, look, part of my thinking here is we have a campus that's gonna be developed, and there's somebody that's gonna have to oversee that, and particularly for I was thinking for the affordable housing projects, when this starts chugging along, there's gonna be a lot of things happening. And I viewed the Hinckley property as the first project to exercise that committee that would carry those kinds of projects
I
out.
agree. Now, I think at that point, though, at that point in our discussion, the presumption was that that was going to be a LIP 40B project. And as we've worked through it with COG, I think that the advice we're getting at this point is we can't do it as a LIP 40B project. So if it was going to be done as a 40B LIP, then the Affordable Housing Trust would be the logical board to oversee it. I think where their analysis and advice has evolved as they've dug into this, it's not going to work that way. It's not going to be, we're not going to be able to do what 2 months ago we thought we could do. I think that's the fair assessment.
If you want, it's like anything else. It's a choose your adventure situation. You have more avenues to pursue standard affordable housing on this site, or even expanded kind of view of affordable housing on this site. But a lot of what would take to make it work and to avoid legal issues would be a home rule petition. From other communities' experiences, that's referred to as a lightning fast process of 2 years, and that would be the lightning fast version. So the question that we're again answering, or that our perspective on the way we're looking at it is, again, what is the least complicated and most expeditious way of addressing this specific
I
site?
get it. That's not my concern, though.
Okay.
I get it. So
Yeah.
that part is,
That was 2
no.
minutes ago.
Yeah, well, it was, but no, given what you said, I now understand it. I'm not concerned about affordable housing. What I'm concerned about is, I think when we complete this senior housing survey that we're about to launch, I think what we're gonna discover is there may be some small segment of seniors that qualify for affordable housing. There's going to be another segment of seniors, perhaps, that qualify for some form of the next level up from affordable housing, but I'm worried they may not. I'm thinking workforce housing or something like that, because I'm not sure they'll get the net, I'm not sure they'll make the net asset screen. They might make the income side. if we can't get into those, I think, I'm assuming, as a town, we are still gonna discuss what is it that the town can do to make housing available for seniors at a price point, and this may not be community or affordable housing, and it can't be a giveaway. So the issue is, what can we do to provide a housing segment at a price point that the seniors are looking for, that may not be subsidized or may not fall under any particular kind of thing that would be state-sponsored, but would simply be putting up a project that provides housing for seniors at a price point that they can afford, that will perform in the marketplace, that will keep that pricing relative to however the market goes still affordable. And I'm looking for the group that can do that. Those citizen petitions are saying, give it to the Senior Housing Committee and the COA. I think those are the wrong groups. I don't think they have the skills to do that. I was thinking the Affordable Housing Trust, not necessarily in a legal restricted sense, but in a skill set sense, were the kinds of people that would have been ideal to oversee that kind of a
Well, I
project.
mean, maybe those, I'm just saying, I think it's, and I know you hate when legal restrictions that don't make sense to you interfere.
Lawyers just do that.
Right,
to
we just,
keep people-
but I think the reality is that the Affordable Housing Trust Board, acting as the Affordable Housing Trust Board, can't do it.
Yeah.
That's why I suggested if
Yeah.
we would create a smaller committee, maybe with some of those same people on it, if they're willing to do it,
yeah.
who would then be,
So-
because again, this is following the development of the plan, coming up with a plan that's gonna be legal, going to town meeting, persuading town meeting over the objections of some people, I'm sure, that this is a good use of the property, town meeting endorsing it, and then we have the implementation question. And I think it's a discrete enough project
Yeah.
that what you're really doing is the project's already designed, is basically this is what it's gonna be. You just need somebody to oversee the developer.
So the only thing I was
What you
saying, you
need-
said that one project, and I'm saying, but I
Well-
want somebody with skills to do that more than once on other projects like this.
Sure, but right now we only have one. I mean, I
It's a
think,
combination of the legality and the economics and
Mhm.
practicality. You could
Yeah.
have all kinds of restrictions, but if it doesn't make economic sense to a developer, you get no responses. So my suggestion would be to reach out to various developers informally and put together something that any one of them would be willing to do if it was out there, which would focus on size, configuration, those types of things. And then you can draft a zoning overlay district or special use or whatever that reflects that, and then put that up.
So to be clear, part of what we've actually been doing for the town and in response to, some of the requests for the town to really kind of start moving on this property in particular is exactly what you're saying, is to sort out what it is that needs to happen to get to a point where the ultimate goal is to provide 16 to 20 cottage-style houses at 350 to maybe 500 on the high end. And in looking at every possible avenue, it is our recommendation that doing it under the umbrella of affordable housing is going to make it more difficult, because most of your local residents are going to be precluded from living there, whether it's because of asset limitations, income limitations, or any other situation. And so as there is no public resource to deal with that, we can't donate it, it can't come from Medfield, it can't come from the state, there's not going to be something to step up to do that. You really are in a situation where you're looking for a market rate solution to your housing situation. And so part of what we've been charged with, and part of what we've been working very actively on for the last couple of months, is coming up with the route forward that makes it happen, that finds a private, a market rate solution to get it on the ground and actually have a shovel hit some dirt.
So what I've heard of that, they do this in the UK, rather than what we always do, we do a statement of work, and then people come in with a price. In the UK, sometimes they'll say, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what we're willing to pay, give us your best technical approach. That I totally agree with, and what I now understand is that the oversight of that is not appropriate for the Affordable House Trust as a affordable house trust.
Because it's not going to
Okay.
be, it's not going to meet the definition, they may not
That's
be the
right,
best
yeah.
king for it, but
Yeah.
because this has
I got it.
been, the site itself has been discussed, it's fairly well, there's fairly good consensus as to what it should look like. You're in good shape to develop an RFP to actually solicit the development community and say,
Okay.
this is what we have in mind, give us your best, come in at your best price and show us what you got.
And then you have a land disposition agreement, pretty straightforward, that enforces it.
First, we need a lot, but,
Right.
you know, once, but several steps along the way, there is a fair, you know, I am sensitive to all of the responses as to various designations or applications with the state for various funding programs and things like that. And, you know, hearing the feedback based on, you know, based on this board and other committees as to how desirable that may be. Sometimes a straightforward solution is never, you know, it's not, you know, you can do it tomorrow, but it's also something that you can do in probably 3 to 6 months if you just kick with it and do it.
I think we share an interest in trying to get something going there sooner, and I guess we don't have to resolve it tonight, but I think my point was, I was thinking it was the Affordable Housing Trust, but it's the skill set of the people that I'm interested in. And I think it would be good if that was a body that not only could do this one, but as we address more of the senior housing issues, it sure would be nice to have a seasoned, experienced group that knows how to do it and has done it successfully to carry it forward for other projects. So, but I get it. Now I understand your memo. Thank you.
So I think as to your broader point, Gus, I mean, I think I agree with you from an administrative standpoint that it makes sense to say that rather than having kind of competing jurisdiction here, we're kind of taking, depending on what happens in response to the Lot 3 RFP, we've kind of taken the recommendation of the MSH MPC and said we're going to try to do what they recommended doing, but rather than having them devote any more time to implement
That's
we
my
will
point,
now
yeah.
do the implementation of that. We will say that this part of it, as we talked about last summer, right? We thought about doing this in June and didn't. I don't know what's really left to be done. I mean, the 40R overlay for Lot 3 in Hinckley, I'm not sure how much sense that makes to me. And so I don't know what's really left to be done for the Master Planning Committee, right? I mean,
One thing I would ask you is that the Hinckley zoning is not in place and it wouldn't qualify for a 40B, so somebody's got to rezone that.
they're going to do it.
Yeah.
They're going to do it. So we're not going to take any more of
I
the.
would love it if you would do it.
Right,
but
no. We're not gonna-
seems to have drifted over here, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
We're not going to take any more.
It-
Yeah, so instead of both doing it, we'll have COG do it with Sarah, and we'll take responsibility for the implementation on both of these fronts. And you can check
I'll
that
send
box.
it back if you want.
I have a question. There are 2 articles on the warrant for the annual town meeting that closes tonight that pertain to this property. What is your wish as far as those 2 articles are concerned? Do you wish to keep them on or remove them?
I think we should keep them on at least until we have a discussion with the Senior Housing Study Committee next week when they come in. And this was not on our agenda for tonight. We've discussed it in an advisory way. But, and to make a decision on it, we should make a decision on it next week, put it on the agenda and have them come in. I mean, this has come up in the context of the hospital, but I don't want to, I talked to Tony about coming in next week. He'll come in next week. We can talk through their articles, kind of, he's seen the memo, and they'll have a chance to think about it and react to the memo. We can talk further about what we're planning to do about it. I think that's what we gotta do. We can, I mean, from a technical standpoint, we can still dismiss it off the warrant.
Okay,
So.
because there are zoning deadlines and for hearings and whatnot. According to your memo, you felt the zoning deadlines had already passed?
It would be very short order to develop an article and get it before the planning board, have all of the required hearings, and also talk to your public and get their feedback. It seemed, frankly, a little bogue to put something on the warrant that nobody had been able to review, and not necessarily good public policy, so we wanted to have a couple of minutes to be able to develop some. Well, first we need a lot, really, I mean, to be honest with you, to figure out what's going on with Hinckley and whether or not there'll be an urban wild or a single-family lot developed off of that. We can develop a zoning, modify the RFP based on what's going on the hospital site. We can move on those things, but there's just, in order to do it by your town meeting deadlines for right now, it would be very rushed, and I don't think you'd get the best quality work. It's a quality control issue, and I wouldn't recommend it.
Is that zoned for coyotes?
What's that?
Is that zoned for coyotes, the urban wild?
Mostly for beavers.
Beaver, yeah.
We got plenty of those.
Bill?
I just, if I missed this as
Microphone.
I apologize if I missed this as part of the interplay between you, Mike, and Gus here, but has any thought been given to since you're, assuming you're still going out in a dual-barreled approach for lot number 3, have you considered making that one of those uses of lot number 3, the residential use, part of the package with what you're doing for Hinckley property? Because you've just given a developer a chance to.
My recommendation was always to keep them together for development.
I had made this recommendation at one of the several meetings where we've had lengthy Ice House Road discussions.
For what it's worth, my recommendation was also to let this process conclude, as you had said, and then go from there and see what you have. It's not without thought of that. It is mostly just responding to the specific question of Hinckley, which is somewhat irrespective of your charge. And so I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to step on your toes. But I've answered a related but slightly different question. But yeah, I think that some contemplation I think it makes sense. Yes.
I mean, that helps you get to your $350,000 if he knows he
It
has
certainly
43
does. I've
rentals.
talked a lot about how far those 42 units would go in helping out something on Hinckley, and particularly with affordability in the standard form. But again, if the research question that I'm asking or that I'm answering is simply is the 16 to 20 cottages at that price point, and how do we get there? It is divorced of all other conditions. That's a logical thing is to move on. To say you plan and to make it happen.
So my only reaction to that was one of the reasons why I was advising you to keep those within our zoning bylaw, because I didn't think you were gonna have enough time to get it onto your regular town meeting. So then you're talking about either you're gonna have another special town meeting at some point, or you're gonna wait till next year before you go forward on Hinckley. So that was.
My view would be we'd have a special town meeting just on Hinckley in the fall, once this process is played out.
The deadline for our annual town meeting is passed, but if we piggybacked on your special town meeting, why couldn't we do that?
Yeah, so that's another approach, is COG drafts the bylaw, but you put it into into the scope of our.
We already have one scheduled, so it's not like there'll be yet another one. Yeah.
And I understand the rationale of keeping the two together. I think I'm still of the view that I'd like to go ahead with what we've agreed on lot 3 and see what happens in response to that RFP. I think if you start linking them together again, you're gonna have to go through the whole Hinckley process, rezone Hinckley, because that's not gonna be a 40B project, and then you're gonna be coupling a 40B project with a non-40B project,
No, I'm not
still
talking
it's
about
gonna
that. I
be.
was just talking about using our town meetings, our special
Yeah.
town meetings.
I was
to
responding to
focus
Bill's
on us.
point about putting lot 3 and Hinckley back together again and waiting on the lot 3 RFP until we've gone through the Hinckley process and had a town meeting vote on Hinckley. So we don't have any.
Becomes a local initiative.
Right, but we
at
still
least
have
as
to
far as-
dispose of the land, we don't have any town meeting authorization to dispose of the Hinckley land. We have town meeting authorization to dispose of lot 3.
The other thing that kind of hangs out in the background too is that we do have the potential when dealing with Hinckley and drafting zoning to go with it, particularly to avoid a spot zoning issue, is whether or not to tie it as a tie it to, rather than tie it geographically, have it as a float or just invoke when certain criteria is met, and so there may be broader applicability to being able to use the zone for more than one site. We need to run some analysis just on how many lots it would impact, because generally what I do is I like to write zoning and deal with the dimensions and then look at what the net hit is going to be the town and whether or not that's something that's going to be something you want to leave on the books, because zoning is something that, it is a barn door, and you can leave it open or you can close it, either way, but you do want to be a little bit careful. And so my thought is that we might be able to make this more useful than just one site.
Absolutely, well, you need the time to analyze so that you don't end up with unintended consequences, particularly if you're gonna have a floating zone. Something that says, for instance, a minimum, it could go anywhere in town on a special permit on a site of at least 5 acres. That's just an example.
We want to look at how many 5-acre lots you
Right.
have. Step one.
Or it could be cobbled together.
Well, the other thing I think you need to consider is you are talking about 45 units of elderly, low-income elderly housing as an expansion of Tilden Village.
Oh,
I don't know whether there's been any decision on the Kelly property on Dale Street, whether that's gonna have an elderly component in it. And then you're talking about 42 units of elderly, low-income housing on Lot 3. So you're talking almost 100 units of low-income elderly. Is there the demand for
before
that?
you add in anything on the campus.
Right,
Before
well,
you-
but
yeah.
but there would only be 11 affordable units at Lot 3.
So you've got 45, 42, and 11.
Well, you have
What do you
11
mean,
affordable and
Oh,
30
on
Lot 3?
Well,
That's-
no, aren't you?
That's been rental, that's 42 units.
It's 42, but it's 11
42.
affordable, 31 market.
Yeah.
11 actual
But no, I'm
affordable.
talking,
I
I'm
think-
talking about total
Right.
affordable, yeah, SHI
I
units.
think, I think Tilden Village is a different proposition, right? Because it's gotta be people who qualify for the state housing. And to me, the response to the RFP will tell us if the market is there, right? Well, someone will have to respond to the RFP, and if the market is there for it, they'll respond to it with a bid that meets the financial hurdle that we put for it. If the market's not there, then they won't, and then we won't build it.
Is
It
everybody,
seems to me instead of
is
guessing what the
everybody
market's gonna be, we're
following
just gonna ask the
my
market.
head here? We just went through a list of affordable units in town that pretty much closed the gap on how many affordable units we have. If that happens, what's the relevance of that master plan with all those affordable units? That's where I've been coming from all along. We're building affordable units in places that we don't need to build them if we're in fact building them here and building them in the other places.
You need to build them because you need the credits to do the buildings.
Well, so what you're,
This is what I've been saying for how many
Does that-
years and months now?
I mean, we're in agreement?
Well, you and I know we agree on lots of things.
Lots of things.
But we're very, very vocal on the things we disagree. But the buildings, the need for tax credits.
Do you have
the
the
need-
microphone?
The need for tax credits
Right.
and affordable
We're in
credits
agreement.
are
Bill just doesn't
driving-
realize it yet.
There are buildings that are losers. Unlike John, I haven't made up my mind about the plan yet. I want to see the incremental, the phase development. I want to see the numbers, the revenue numbers. I want to see what it means to the town over time. I've always been interested in flexibility. In this plan, I think with an incremental development has the flexibility we would need to react to marketplace changes that happen 5 years from now or 10 years from now or whatever. It's a long build-out. This plan has a long build-out. We should take advantage of it, and I think we can. But if you look at how the spreadsheets that accompany the package that you got, and if you looked at what they looked like back in June, you will see buildings that were $8 or $9 or $10 million losses. And then the uses for those buildings, with putting more units into those buildings, essentially brought them so that for a developer, they're not a losing scheme. As far as I can see at the moment, it's a developer package, it's not a town package. And I'm not faulting the committee for that. The committee's consultant was given a job. This is that consultant's interpretation of how she gets that job done and how she meets the goal of her subcontract. So I'm not faulting anybody here, but I have some issues with that. We started out talking about trying to save 10 buildings and then perhaps build new buildings to fill in the missing teeth, if you will, around the quad as we went along. That's gone by the boards to make this project, because of the infrastructure, because of some demolition or rehab costs or anything else, to make this profitable for a developer. I don't know that it's profitable for the town. I haven't seen the numbers. So, but again, you ask why are we going to, at the risk of building affordable units that we don't need? It's because we need them for the buildings. You have to decide if you need the buildings.
Phil, you missed my question. I'm saying I understand that. I'm saying that when you put up affordable units everywhere else in town, and the town no longer needs affordable units, what happens to a master plan that has affordable units in it? So we're in you and I are in agreement,
I'd just like to
though. We're
point
not-
out, you always need affordable units because it's a moving target. You lose houses you lose properties off your inventory. The housing stock continues to increase, and every 10 years with the federal census, you get reevaluated.
Right.
If you drop even a percentage below, or any incremental amount below the 10%, you're right back where you
I
started.
understand, Mark. We just passed a bunch of bylaws that actually require all developments to build at a rate above the 10% level. So this thing, once we hit the target, if our bylaws were written as tightly as I think they were,
Which is for multifamily housing.
No, it's single units too.
yeah,
You've raised, it's 15%, 20.
yeah,
It's only multi, it doesn't apply to subdivisions of single
Because it's some serious question whether you can impose affordability on residential subdivisions legally.
So you're recommending that we overshoot drastically on our
I'm not
affordable
saying,
housing?
my only point was, you don't just you don't hit the 10% and say, eureka, we're here, and you rest on your
Well,
laurels.
yeah, I did think we had bylaws that were kind of designed to keep us out in
We
front of that
try,
once
we
we
do the
got there.
best we can, but.
Well, as your housing consultant, what I will say is that while you have a number of projects that are potentially, that could potentially add SHI units, none of them are funded at this point in time, 100% shovel-ready and are in the ground. And so, part of what we do, and part of why we can't say that this master plan is irrelevant, is because I can't guarantee you that you're going to get funded for Tilden Village. I can't guarantee you're going to get those, that extra building and those 30 to 50% AMI units for extremely low mod elderly. The other thing is that if you apply to DHCD to only list elderly units on the SHI, DHCD will let you do that. DHCD is going to comment on that at a certain point, that you're not fulfilling housing diversity goals, and that you're only putting age-restricted housing on the rolls. The state's very explicit that what they want is rental housing, they want family housing. The state has their goals, and if you are not working towards the state goals, they will eventually, there will be commentary about it, and they may not accept what you are trying to do. So part of it is really about peppering the field and making sure that you stay above 10%, because it takes a lot of projects to keep you there.
Well, I agree with that, but we have a housing production plan that has a lot of, we could just justify every lot doing that. That doesn't really help.
Was part of the housing production plan as
Yeah,
well.
we assessed the state hospital as part of, when we did the housing production plan, we've looked at a lot of different things, and it really is about the development pipeline and making sure that you stay above 10% by using a diverse approach.
I think
But
we're making
we got caught a little
an
bit
obvious
by the
point.
town getting religion about affordable housing and sort of passing us by. I mean,
Yeah.
this wasn't the landscape when we started on this a couple of years ago. So, number one. Number two is, I had those numbers up, and I'm not sure you do Tilden and you do that. I mean, and maybe if you do everything on your plan, you're getting close to where you are, but there's a lot of ifs. So I'm not sure I conclude that, let's skip the plan because we got it in the bag.
I'm not sure you understood what I'm saying. I'm not saying skip the plan. If we did everything on the plan, we'd way overshoot.
I'm
We
not
do
sure
have
way
more.
over. That's what I'm saying. I'm not sure way over.
Well,
We have
all
73.
all right.
We have 73 units of affordable.
I think I was trying to make one point, and now we're
Well, I'm just saying we had
revisiting
73
40B.
units on the count of affordable, so I don't think we're like hugely overshooting. And as to Bill's point, the low-income housing tax credit may make it more feasible to save some of those buildings. But I think I explained to everybody, we aren't requiring the buildings to be saved. We'll have some affordability we want up there, which could be adjusted depending on how well the town does with these other projects. But it's not a case where we're driving the project bigger because we want more affordable housing, or we're dictating affordable housing.
I wasn't saying that at all.
Well,
So
no,
let
Bill
me
said
let me
that.
tell
I'm just
let me tell
addressing
you what I
Bill-
was saying.
I'm just addressing what Bill said, because I think it's a mischaracterization of where we ended up with our plan and why we ended up with our plan.
Oh, so
Are we
it's
done with
Billy
lot,
disagrees.
Gus, are we done with lot
Yeah,
3?
we can cut that.
Poor Pete's standing back there. If we're done with lot 3, Nathan, you can come back.
Yeah. You were wavering a little bit on your feet there.
I stand at work all day.
Somebody
I'm
should've-
tired of sitting.
Somebody should have brought him a bottle of
Back
water or
there.
something. All right, all right.
I think we'll finish discussion next week.
Tune in 2 weeks, same channel, same station for a continuation.
Only 1 week this time.
It's gonna be a cereal.
So I'm back to, and my question now coming back is, do we have anything else to do, or can we go home?
You have to close the warrant.
Yeah, we're gonna close the warrant, but other than that,
I have one more thing to raise. And
Okay.
this is just a question for a future agenda item with respect to
you're
the.
trying to get us to 11:30 again.
Not at all. No, I have a lot of work to do when I get home. So, with respect to the Kelly project, it is on the agenda for the Affordable Housing Trust next Tuesday at 6. I was not planning to have it on the Board of Selectmen agenda for that same night. And so, but I wanted to know from the two of you kind of what schedule you want to be on for the Board of Selectmen to decide yay or nay on the LIP project. I think what the Affordable Housing Trust will talk about next week is the board's view on it. I don't know whether the board will vote on it or not next Tuesday night, but we will we'll discuss it, because we haven't really discussed it since the original presentation back in January. How would you like us to proceed in light of that next step? How do you want to handle this in the Board of Selectmen?
So I guess the question that I'd like an answer to is whether or not the 36 units is the appropriate number of units to make it financially feasible for Mr. Kelly. I guess I think of it in terms of, I would like to have the least number of units that makes it work financially for him. And I can't do that analysis. I don't know that Courtney can do that analysis for us, or somebody else. I'm sure somebody can, but I don't know whether COG can do it. But I would like to have some sort of input as to whether Mr. Kelly is really giving us the right number of units, or whether we should be
We
pushing
can
back.
discuss that, the trust board can discuss that next week, and hopefully some of the real estate experts on the board can.
Well, no, okay, oh, that'd be great.
Just I'd like to let him know kind of when, I think we'd have then a formal meeting and presentation from him to the Board of Selectmen, when you'd like to do that in this schedule. What you'd like from the Affordable Housing Trust Board, and then when you'd like to schedule him in.
So, assuming we get to the right answer on the number of units, I'm ready to go forward with it at any time. The people at your Affordable Housing Trust meeting were so complimentary of Mr. Kelly and how he had answered all of their needs and their questions, that to me, that pretty much solved my thinking, that if the neighbors are in favor of it, then as a town official, the only issue for me is 36 the right number of units?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that the takeaway I got, that all the neighbors were in favor of it, and they certainly were not as opposed to it as they were the previous proposal, and appreciated the effort that he'd put in to respond to their concerns. So it sounds like we could put this on for our hearing, and Mr. Kelly and kind of other people who want to come and make input on the 27th, meeting the 27th, or.
Sure.
And then,
Yeah, my answer to it, Mike, is my impression, and much of it is secondhand, is that he's done a lot to address the concerns of, if you just look at the gross Plan A versus his current plan, he's clearly done a lot. Everything I've heard is, while maybe not everybody's on board with it, it sounded to me like Emra fundamentally was on board with it.
I don't think they took a position on it formally. But.
Okay. Well, let me put it a different way. I would trust you, working with the Affordable Housing Trust, to advise us on whether you're comfortable, and the trust is comfortable, that we have achieved a sufficient acceptance of this, that it could come before us. My personal impression, having gone on the site walk and having talked with him at some length, is that he now understands, if he didn't understand before, how to work with the town. Seems like he's worked, and he's gotten some positive feedback on that. His plan, if you weren't in the workforce housing, well, no, it was the presentation we had at the MMA annual meeting in the morning at the Selectmen's meeting. He was using actually pictures from what they had up there from the projects in East Greenwich, so the design, which looked good in the pictures, if that's the kind of design he has, I think he's on a good track with the for sale units. It's hard in a diagram, like having three buildings right up against the road is a little hard to visualize. Is that gonna be okay? Just because you're looking at a drawing? So the only thing that, in the design that I said, is that too close? That was the only thing that caught, but I trust the Affordable Housing Trust on that, and I trust them on the numbers, so at the point that that the trust is satisfied, I
All
would
right,
schedule
well,
it.
we'll put it down then for the trust board will take it up next Tuesday, and then we'll put this on our agenda for the 27th.
Good.
For a presentation
Okay,
from
good.
him and all that. And I'll work with Christina on getting the notices out. on
Yeah,
those.
let's work on that tonight.
So that was the only other thing.
Okay,
I wanted to
all
raise,
right.
just
The
to
only-
schedule.
only other minor point, I know you're aware somewhat, but the survey, the senior housing survey, Barbara and Dick have been doing some great work and working to finalize that survey. Barbara reported she managed to get it down to 4 pages, which is a magic number for a booklet to go out. What we would like to do at this point, and we can probably continue this discussion next week, but we obviously would like Tony, who's already done a survey, we'd like to get his support on that if we can. With this one, the intention is for it to go out to all households in Medfield, so this is not a sampling, this is a survey, so it would behoove any seniors who actually care about senior housing to make sure that their voices are heard. What we're trying to figure out, as you know, is it's great to know how many units, but knowing what kind of units and what location, buy versus rent, and over what time frame, that kind of, and probably one more would be how many of seniors do qualify for affordable versus maybe a looser versus, no, they're just out looking for, you know, a good price on a market rate house. I think we need to know all that before we really know how to put together a plan that's gonna make sense, so.
Thank you.
Okay.
You need a motion to close the warrant?
Need a motion to close the warrant, and the Public Works Director has asked that you declare a snow emergency, given the fact, particularly today's storm, there's possible storm for Sunday and a possible storm for next Thursday. He's not out of money, he's out of money in the wage account. He has about $90,000 left in the operations account because he hasn't been using too many private contractors, and he has plenty of salt and sand, so. But he does need a declaration of snow emergency, and you need to vote to close the warrant.
Does he need it tonight?
Gotta wait for the
Payroll
weather.
goes through next week, so I'd say yes, he does.
Well, I mean, I don't, I mean, obviously this has happened in the past with this request, not from this Public Works Director, where the
Yes,
request has come in and there was not a need for it. I mean, I'm gonna trust that the accounts have been
No, there
examined
is,
and
yes.
there is a need for it in this circumstance.
Yes, if he could take the money from his operations account and use it to pay wages, there wouldn't be a need for it, but he can't do that until the last 2 months of the fiscal year.
I see.
So he does need it.
Okay. As long as that's been vetted and checked, then I'll move that we declare a snow emergency.
Is there a second? Any further discussion? All in favor? Yep.
All right, and I'll also move that we close the warrant for the annual town meeting.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yep. Okay. Thank you everybody for coming.
Second.